Well, welcome back to Comic Book Historians. I'm Alex Strand. Today we have a very special guest, Mr. Bud Plant. Bud Plant was owner of one of the, if not the largest comic book store franchise in the United States at one time. He was also distributor of comics for a large geographic region of the United States at one point, and also is a comic art and book dealer of Bud's Art Books, and that's been going on for decades. He is actually also very well read, a comic book historian and a historian of many things, including pulps, books, and all sorts of paraphernalia. He has an incredible library. Bud, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Alex. That was a good intro. I can't think of any flaws in that one, so we can move on.
Exactly. Basically, Bud and I have been friends for a few years now. We met through a mutual friend, someone who used to work at Comics and Comix, which Bud co-founded in the early 70s. Nicely enough, we've hung out every few months for a few years and had a lot of fun discussions, looked at a lot of old comics, so we're very familiar with each other. Bud, if you could let the audience know, you were born in 1952 in San Jose. What did your parents do?
My dad was like a kind of a maintenance engineer, with no degree behind him, but he worked at a big company that had about 500 employees. They manufactured electronic equipment, and he was the go-to guy for keeping things maintained and running. And my mom was a registered nurse. Mm-hmm. And then they actually, the interesting story about them, the most interesting part, I think, is that they met on a troop ship going to North Africa in World War II in 1942. And they're both first lieutenants. My mom was in the nurse corps. My dad was in the signal corps. Mm-hmm. Signal corps was going to North Africa to establish radio stations in preparation for the invasion of Europe, which was going to come up and go up through Italy, starting in North Africa. Anyway, they met on a troop ship and got married in Cairo, Egypt in 1943. So, so I'm a war baby, I guess.
Now, did that Cairo origin, did that kind of give you an international perspective just from the beginning of having more of a global look at the world?
Whether or not it's influenced by that, I think I've always had a fascination with World War II. And I think a lot of us in the comic world have that, because comics sort of came into their own in World War II. We all look back on that and so, boy, that was a different time, and everybody was pulling together. And yeah, here's my parents, they were actively part of that right through the war.
Your dad read some comics too, some comic strips, is that right?
I wouldn't say he was a comic fan. I couldn't ever identify any particular comics that he read, but he definitely read the funny pages when I was a kid, ever since I can remember. And he'd buy an occasional collection of comic strips. Back in the late 50s, early 60s, there was Peanuts, and there was Pogo and Blondie, strips like that. Barnaby, I think, would get collected into little paperbacks and stuff. And somehow my dad would end up with those every once in a while. So we had a few of those kicking around the house. And then, of course, the big thing for me was they got a subscription of Walt Disney's Comics and Stories for the family. I have two older sisters, 4 years older and 6 years older. And so, our big event was hunting the mailbox every month and getting an issue of Walt Disney's Comics and Stories, the one comic that my parents subscribed to.
Mm-hmm. And so they subscribed to that for you to read it, basically,
for
right?
Us to, yeah, I think. And my dad certainly read it. I don't think my mom cared. My mom was never really into, she had better things to do, like cook dinner, take care of the house. But yeah, my sisters and I used to fight over who got to read the latest issue first.
Yeah. And so could you tell that there was a good duck artist at that point?
I don't know if I could say he was the good duck artist, but I know that I really enjoyed the Donald Duck stories a lot more than the rest of the issues. I mean, they've always meant more to me. So even as a little kid, but I just know that the stories were a lot of fun. As I grew up, I kept reading Carl Barks stuff. I don't know quite how soon I got into Uncle Scrooge and all that, but I definitely enjoyed them. I mean, I remember those long, full-length stories to this day of the Scrooge and the kids going out on adventures. Those are just wonderful.
My generation grew up on that DuckTales show, which is basically based on the comics that Barks did for the most part.
Oh yeah, okay, sure. Which yeah. I've never watched.
Yeah, it's basically they're just kind of rehashing Carl Barks for most of that.
Yeah.
And in one episode, I think they actually credit him, and I was like, oh wow, okay. Like I noticed that later.
When I first got into comics, there was already coterie, a group of people collecting Karl Barks stuff, but it was so plentiful back in, say, 1965, 1966, 67, that you could get just about any of the comics except the super rare early ones. You could get them for a quarter a piece or 50 cents a piece. I mean, they were like, you know, all over the place, but there was hardcore guys saying, yeah, I'm really into ducks. And so was I. I mean, me and my buddies all sort of collected those, but they weren't the sexy stuff like the ECs or the Frazetta books, but still we all had our little modest Barks collection going back to, you know, the early 50s or something like that.
You develop a taste for comics with the Walt Disney comics. Then where did you start looking to get more comics from? Like, was there a local store that you, in the late 50s, that you were getting more comics from?
Well, the big event for me happened in 61, and there was a couple stores, drugstores fairly close by to my house. I could walk or ride my bike to two of them. Probably in 61, I wasn't big enough to go to the big liquor store that was about 3 miles away. That was probably a little too much. So say the two local stores, I somehow got a batch of comics in late 61. And I remember every one of them super well, and I've recollected them and stuff. And they included Brave and the Bold 34 with Hawkman by Kubert, a copy of One of the Strange Adventures with a guy with a machine on his head on the cover. It's supposed to be a bomb that's going to go off if he doesn't solve the problem. Yeah, let's see. There was a Sergeant Rock. I think that it was a nurse in the story. So that was like, oh yeah, it's like my mom in the war, you know. But the big one was Fantastic Four 1. Somehow I picked up Fantastic Four 1 at the same time. There was also Tales to Astonish 22. So I can really remember all these comics. And my folks must have given me $1 or something, or $1.50, and I went and bought all these 10-cent comics. I might have bought a few after that, but I didn't get into collecting. I have really strong memories of those comics. And then the next thing I really remember is I got hooked on Sergeant Rock. And I even had a subscription to Sergeant Rock. And then all of a sudden, boom, I discovered Marvels. But this was not until, let's see, I bought FF18, but I didn't start collecting FF until about 31. It would have been the spring, I think, of 1964. And I would have been 12. And all of a sudden, boom, I somehow discovered them. I must have wandered by the drugstore and picked up like Spider-Man 13 would have been my first Spider-Man. I must have picked up 1 or 2 of them and started reading them going, oh shit, these things are great. And they're still only 12 cents. And so it was all imminently affordable at that point. So you could buy every Marvel comic for the month for what, 12 times what, 8 or 10 titles? That's all they had right then. So for $1.20, which is a lot of, you know, bottles you could pick up along the roadside and turn in for deposits, which is what a lot of kids did, plus yard work and stuff. I could have every Marvel that came out. And that's when I got, you know, thoroughly hooked and became like a Marvel maniac.
Marvel maniac, that's cool.
Yeah, I was embarrassed. I was embarrassed to be getting Sergeant Rock. I was reading all those Stan Lee soapboxes and go, oh shit, I've got a subscription to Sergeant Rock, and that's Brand Echh, and that's you know, bad stuff. What was I thinking? These are so much better than Sergeant Rock is.
Yeah. So there was like, you saw the Fantastic Four 1 in 61, but it wasn't until a few years later to really jumped on that bandwagon. Did that first issue not really get your attention that much yet as a 9-year-old?
I tell you, I got great memories of those comics, but I guess there was other things going on in my world, and going out and finding comics did not immediately become a part of it. I mean, I got into little baseball cards and you know, I don't know if I was collecting. Was I collecting anything else?
Yeah.
Not necessarily. I mean, collecting didn't really run in my family. Though it's weird that I would have picked up FF18. So there was something going on that one issue, because I found that FF18 when I started, like I say, the story of collecting comics starting in 64. I went back and said, wait a minute, I remember reading these and they looked different. I remember the Fantastic Four looked different. And I searched the whole house and I found a copy of number 18, but I never found that number 1. The number 1 was gone.
Yeah.
So, you know, there was a little bit of something going on there, but it was like just an occasional thing, like going to the movies or, you know, going to a swimming pool. I mean, it was just, you know, it hadn't really grabbed me and said, oh, you can now go out and buy these things for yourself.
Yeah. And I think by 18, it was really well defined, the flavor that they were going for. I think that first issue was still somewhat amorphous. I think once you see the cool costumes and the fantastic car and all that stuff in full swing, I think that'll grab kids way more effectively, probably. You also got introduced to some Golden Age comics, and that was by reading, was that through the Jules Pfeiffer article in Playboy? Because your dad had a
Yeah,
collection of that?
exactly. I'm not sure which came first, the article or the book. It
Huh?
might have been the article.
Yeah.
I might have somehow gotten I used to, steal the Playboys out of my dad's bottom drawer. Classic, classic story that he never showed them to me, but I quietly pull that drawer open when nobody was around and check out the Playboys. And I saw that, but I did get, I think my mom actually bought me a copy of the book because the book was $4 or $5.
Yeah.
It wasn't cheap. But I think I got it for a Christmas present. And that was that was a huge eye opener, because up until that point, the only thing you knew about Golden Age was if Marvel mentioned something about it, mentioned about Captain America being around since the 40s or something, but the knowledge was that thin. But all of a sudden, boom, the Pfeiffer book opens us all up and you go, whoa, who's this guy, the Spirit? And look at it, Superman looks really different and Batman looks really different. And that was a big deal.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it's not like there was Google to search for that stuff. So it was that article or that book, and then that like opens all these kids' eyes to what went on 20 years ago. That's huge.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, DC was doing the 80-page giants, and trying to think if I bought any of the 80-page giants. I think I bought a Batman. I think I bought one of the early Batmans, and that was sort of interesting because it was like these old Batman stories.
Yeah.
But of course, they still didn't measure up. They didn't usually measure up to anything Marvel was doing at the time. But I do have sort of fond memories of that sort of weird nostalgic thing, looking at these old Batman stories. But
yeah, and that Jack Schiff Batman from the early 60s, before that new look happened, they weren't that.
They're horrible comics, but actually the 80-page giants, they did go back a little further, and they got some more decent stuff. I mean, the Batman in the 50s, early 50s, mid 50s, those were okay. I mean, Batman just went steadily downhill by the late 50s, early 60s. They were just horrible. I mean, they were everything that a comic fan at Marvel would say that is horrible stuff. And Superman, I don't know, it wasn't much better. I've learned to appreciate Superman a lot more from the Silver Age, and I like the whole Superman family thing. Weisinger was doing a nice job, but by 1964, 65, yeah, still Superman didn't measure up to Spider-Man and Fantastic Four and stuff. Kurt Swan was doing okay stuff. I have to say that, but the stories had sort of pooped out. I like reading the Superman stories, all the way up to sometime in the late 50s, early 60s. They're still pretty good. They're still, the whole family thing is sort of fun with Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane and all that. I got all the Lois Lanes. They're beautifully drawn by Kurt Schaffenberger. Just don't read too many of them at one time, because you go, whoa, I think I've already heard this plot before. It's Lois Lane wanting to get married to Superman again. But, but they're okay. And they're cheap too. You could collect all the Lois Lanes for next to nothing.
So by 1965, you're really into the Marvel vibe. You had then learned about how Captain America and Submariner had a Golden Age history with the Pfeiffer article.
Right.
And so then there was, what I had read about you was that there was there's a story about a local, like, kind of bookstore, they had dollar comics, and you got introduced through other fans through that. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that was, there was a store called Twice Read Bookstore in downtown San Jose, and they were the place you'd go to for used books. And they'd like if I was looking for like little Lone Ranger books, the little hardcover Lone Ranger books and Gene Autry's or something like that, you could go there and find them. And I think as a kid, like Bomba the Jungle Boy, I was into Bomba the Jungle Boy, I was into Tarzan, and my sisters might take me down there because it was about 6 miles from my parents' house. So that's a long ways when you're a kid at 12. But we go down there and scope out the place. Anyway, they had in the front of the store, real typical, they had a counter right next to the guy that ran the store, and it had a couple stacks of comic books there. They even had coverless comics that the guy would carefully put plastic around. He'd glue the plastic to the back cover and put a little plastic cover on just to somehow preserve it, make it look like it's worth more money or something. But all the comics, I think, at the time were essentially, they probably were either nickel or a dime a piece for a used comic. So this would be, say, 1965, mid 1965. So new comics were 12 cents. They probably were a nickel. I don't think they were even 10 cents. They probably were a nickel. And at the flea market, which I got into fairly around the same time, any comic at the flea market was a nickel, no matter what it was. You know, unless somebody was like crazy, you know, thinking, oh yeah, well, this is older, should be worth a little bit more. But nickel was the going price for a used comic. So anyway, I go down there and I'm going through their comics and looking for whatever. You could sometimes get coverless Atlas. You know, you'd recognize, you go, yeah, that sort of looks like an old Stan Lee comic somehow. It's a monster and stuff, you know, but it wasn't terribly old comics. You're talking about stuff from the mid 50s. That was only 10 years old at that point. But anyway, some kid comes in and asks the proprietor to see the dollar comics. And this, you know, this is a memory of a memory at this point. So all I can say, you know, my memory of a memory is a big light bulb goes off above my head. And I go, what? Dollar comics? What is a dollar comic? And the guy gets out a little stack of comics and shows them to him. And the guy doesn't buy a comic. And I go, can I look at the dollar comics? You know, in my little Charlie Brown, you know, attitude. No, oh, yeah, okay, wow. And I go through them. I found a Thrills of Tomorrow, number 18, which reprinted Stuntman. You know.
Oh yeah.
Not the most spectacular book in the world, but it's friggin' Simon and Kirby.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, I mean, Kirby, I certainly know who Kirby is. And I'm going, wow, this is old Jack Kirby doing this really wild stuff. And Stuntman was a good strip. It was a great comic that never really went.
I liked it a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so I buy this one comic. So I walk out the door and this kid goes, hey, are you into comics? You know, and I go, yeah, you know, I am. And so he goes, hey, well, I know all these guys that are into comics and, you know, they're doing a little fanzine and they And I go, well, cool. Well, so we'll have to get together. So we exchange addresses or phone numbers or something. And eventually my mom takes me across town because this guy is way the hell and gone. It's like 15, 18 miles across town, which again, when you're a kid, that's a long, long ways. But my mom took me over there and through him, I met John Barrett, who became my partner in Comics and Comix. Jim Buser, who also became one of the partners and who I know to this day. Unfortunately, John is gone, he passed away. And I met all these guys. There was this other contingent of people in San Jose.
And Michelle Nolan also, right? Who was there?
And absolutely, and Michelle Nolan. Michelle Nolan has a great story. What she did, she was going to the flea market looking for comics before she had met me. And I'm not sure if she had met John and Jim or not. Maybe not. Because we were living a little bit apart. She was partly up the peninsula, so she was a little more removed from us. Anyway, she goes to the flea market and she runs into some kid. And the kid says, hey, I know other people that have comics. Are you looking for comics? And this kid's just a hustler. He's just this young hustler. And he says, oh, for $5, I think it was $5. Might have been less, might have been a couple bucks. For $5, I'll take you to this guy's house and introduce you to him. And so somehow she pays this kid money to somehow come over to my house. And because, you know, everybody's looking for old comics. Of course, we're all like trying to get out there and score the good stuff before somebody else does. So she ends up coming to my house. I remember very little detail about that whole shenanigans. But anyway, that's how I met Michelle. You know, and I don't know, did I sell her some comics? Who knows?
Maybe, yeah.
Actually, a lot of that stuff I can document because I kept these rather loose, funky journals all the way through this period. So I do have about documentation on what I picked up at the flea market and, you know, when I first met Jim and Buser and those guys, you know, that sort of thing.
Now, there was also the San Jose Mercury ads, classifieds. And was it through there that you met Jim Badabunker? Is that right?
You could advertise in, the Mercury. There was some kind of swapper thing. I don't think I ever advertised through there, but one or two of the other guys did. It could be Michelle did. You may know more about the story than I do at this point, because I've forgotten the details. But there was somebody, Badabunker could have been advertising, you know, hey, looking for old comics, give me a call. Because boy, those were the days, because people didn't think comics were worth anything. So you put a little ad in there and some kid goes, oh yeah, I've got a stack of comics. Wow, maybe I can sell them. And boom, all of a sudden you got a little comic collection put together. So the guys that the slightly older guys that had a car that could get somewhere and had a little tiny bit of money, you know, could go out and score stuff. I don't know how much of that really went on, but that was another way people started getting together and meeting each other.
Now, did y'all make any fanzine of any kind together?
Well, yes and no. When I first met John and Jim in 1965, in late 65, they were working on a magazine called Eccentric. I think it was Eccentric. Yeah, it was Eccentric. And it was a Ditto magazine. And John actually had a Ditto machine in his garage that he was running. And Jim Buser, I know, was doing stencil artwork. Jim was never an artist, but hey, he was doing it. And I think Michelle got involved. Well, I could be wrong. Michelle may not have gotten involved that quickly. But anyway, they were doing this fanzine. They did a couple of issues. Boom, sort of end of that story. But when I got involved in, once I got involved with fandom and discovered the big deal was the Rockets Blast. The big deal was these guys go, hey, did you know that there's a comics fandom? Of course I don't. I never heard of any of that stuff. All this, they go, well, here, get this. You need to get this Rockets Blast. It's all full of comics for sale, and there's articles, and there's other fanzines, and that opened up this blossoming giant world to me as a 12-year-old. And I contributed. I wrote an article on Mystery in Space for a magazine, or for one of the fanzines. God, the publisher was Don Dagoneus. I think it was called Comic Scene, very forgettable article on Mystery in Space. But now this would have been, by this time, had to be a year or two later. So this has to be 66, 67. I got turned on back to DCs again by John and Jim and those guys, because they're going, oh, you only collect Marvels. Well, what about Adam Strange and the Atom and the Flash and Green Lantern? Those are good comics. Those aren't Superman and Batman. This is good stuff. And so I got all turned on to them and discovered Mystery in Space, which I love.
The Julius Schwartz.
The Julius Schwartz stuff. Yeah, all the Schwartz stuff. That was the best DC stuff that was coming out.
And do you remember which issue of Rocket Blast ComicCollector that you first read?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was number 43. Yeah, everybody dates their beginning getting into fandom with back in those days, it was with what issue of Rocket Blast did you get? And mine was number 43. I know Jim Buser, he's my age, but he got into fandom much earlier. And I think his first issue was something like 20 something. I mean, he was really in early. Jim's big claim to fame is that he sent a letter, and he was one of these letter writers like I was. I got a few, I had a few published letters in the Marvels in 65, 66, something like that. Jim counted every panel that every member of the Justice League appeared in the first, whatever it was, 20 issues or 25 issues, and sent this letter in and said, okay, you guys are not doing justice to so-and-so because he only appeared in this many panels, but here's the panel countdown for Wonder Woman and Green Lantern and Superman. And I think they made some funny comment about it. Boy, you're a really dedicated fan there, buddy,
Yeah, tracking them down. We were looking at a page from Daredevil 16, but you had written letters to Marvel, right?
Yeah. I don't know how many letters I sent them, but they published, I think I had maybe 3 or 4 letters published. No big deal. And I can barely, I remember the Daredevil 16, of course, because that was one of the longer letters. I had wrote a letter to one of the cowboy comics, Kid Cold or Two Gun Kid. There might have been a letter in Sergeant Fury.
But it was pretty cool, because especially Daredevil 16, because that's Ramita doing Daredevil. And I think that's like celebrated stuff before he really took off on Spider-Man. So that's pretty cool that you're in that issue.
That's true. Yeah, and the big deal back then was also joining the Merry Marvel Marching Society, the MMMS. And they were publishing everybody's names in there. So my big deal was FF40. My name's the very bottom, Bud Plant in San Jose, California. I got my name in a Fantastic Four, which was to me probably a much bigger deal than just getting a letter in some stray issue of Kid Colt.
So you're also then looking for back issues, but they weren't called back issues back then. They were just older comics, I guess. Yeah. But how were you getting those? Were they from trading from friends? How was that working?
Well, before the Rockets Blast, yeah, it would have just been friends. I mean, I was going to school, and I had 2 or 3 buddies that collected comics too, and even as early as then or shortly thereafter, my buddies sometimes would give up collecting comics and move on. So all of a sudden, I might buy a bunch of their comics from them. Didn't happen a lot, but it happened a little bit. The big deal for me was, like I mentioned, the flea market. I was 3 miles away from one of the best flea markets on the West Coast. The San Jose Flea Market was sort of, there was also a pretty good one in Oakland, but I never got up there. But San Jose Flea Market was a really good flea market. And I could ride my bike down to the flea market and take, maybe $4 or $5. That's all I would have, in my pocket, and buy comics for a nickel a piece. And so I started, I discovered that's where I could get old comics more than at the old bookstore. They didn't have a whole big selection of it, but you could get fresh fodder at the flea market. And so I'm starting to collect comics in '64. Well, I can get comics from '63, '62 that are a year or two old that I didn't already have. Tales to Astonish with, Giant Man and Ant-Man, and Tales of Suspense, and just whatever would come up. I think I got into Magnus Robot Fighter, and I found some back issues of that. There was a lot of comics floating around at the flea market. And of course, I'm being picky at 5 cents. I should have been buying everything. And once I got into our first store, that's what I would do, is go down and buy everything, that I thought I could get more than a nickel for. But in the early days, I was just going for my own back issues.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so you also mentioned that you like the new look Batman, as well as Atom and Green Lantern and Flash. Right. What do you think it is that Julius Schwartz offered to readers at the time that, let's say, Weisinger and some of the other editors didn't?
Schwartz didn't write down to people. Even Weisinger pulled together a really good Superman mythos that was interesting, but it was still being written for 12-year-olds or something. Schwartz wrote for an older audience. Schwartz came out of science fiction fandom. And he did fanzines when he was a kid and stuff. And I think he appreciated the fact that there's an older audience for comics. And I think he wrote to that audience. I had friends that were already, that I met at that point that were older than me. Like Michelle was, 3-4 years older than me. Tom Tallman was another good buddy. He had a job at the post office. He was a little older. And those guys loved Carl Barks, and they loved the Schwartz DC books, the Adam Strange and Green Lantern. They were just written, I think, to an older audience, just like EC had done in the 50s. DC was doing that. They were just elevating the quality of the material. They did good. Adam Strange is full of good scientific stuff, good solid science fiction, that it wasn't people just punching each other like they still do today in comics. It was Adam Strange would solve problems scientifically, by using his head and being smart. And I think, the guys that were a little bit older than that, that's what really appealed to them.
Who were your favorite comic artists by this point? Let's say 1966.
Kirby, Steve Ditko, I think Infantino and Anderson over at DC. I don't know if I could say Kubert at this point. I think Kubert I learned to appreciate sort of later on. I loved those early Hawkmans, but Kubert has sort of a different style. If you throw Steranko into the mix, all of a sudden, whoa, Steranko is like the man, representing a new younger generation of artists. This is pre-Neil Adams. Adams didn't come into the story at that point. So Steranko was a big deal. Everybody was really excited to see Steranko start to develop in Strange Tales. And then when the Shield started coming out, it was like, that was the equivalent of Frazetta, showing up in comics. Now, of course, and that brings in Frazetta and all that. We very soon in 65, 66, 67, we all started collecting the good artists, which could be Carl Barks, that's fine, but they're also Frazetta, Al Williamson, Wally Wood, Roy Krinkle, all the guys that had been doing EC comics and had been doing Atlas stuff for Stan after EC, went belly up. And, there was no price guide and no internet and everything at that point. So what you did is when you found a stack of old comics, you just start piling through them and going, oh, there's a story by Angela Torres, or oh, there's a Wally Wood story in this Atlas comic. That's weird. Or you'd find some other off-brand thing and go, oh, there's a story by Frazetta or something. He was doing those silly little funny animal things, little one-pagers. And so we started looking for that kind of thing too.
That's cool. So those names guided the back issue collecting, basically.
Yeah.
Were you looking at Pulp magazine reprint books as well at this point?
As soon as one of the first books on pulps came out, I know I picked it up and got sort of interested in pulps, but we didn't see, as a kid, I didn't see much as far as pulps go. I came across one batch at the flea market, a big stack of Planet stories, which was I still love Planet, and I've got them all. I got all of them now. That was the first time I actually bought a bunch of pulps. I think they were the guys wanted they were 2 for a quarter or something like that, but they were from the 40s, and so that was ancient history in 1966 or something when I picked those up. But other than that, my pulp experience didn't start until we got into the store, and when we opened the store in '68, and people would bring pulps into us. They'd bring you a big box of amazing stories and fantastic adventures and the common pulps. I don't remember getting a big stack of Shadows, any of the really weird tales. You didn't get the really sexy pulps. I mean, they got the more common science fiction pulps in various conditions. I mean, could be in anything. We'd buy them for whatever, a nickel or a dime a piece, and then whatever we did, we'd split up the good ones we wanted amongst the guys in the store and then sell the rest of them. So it means most of the good stuff just got split up and went into our collection. Oh boy, I've got another copy of Weird Tales. That's cool, take it home.
What was your favorite EC Comics story?
Well, my favorite story, definitely.
My World?
No. When you say my favorite, it ought to be, and it ought to be one of the science fiction stories, But when you say my favorite story, what always comes up for me, I think it's a Tales from the Crypt story drawn by, I think it's George Evans, but it could be Jack Davis. It's about an old fat guy that has a care home for old people, and he's pocketing all the money from the government to take care of the old people, and then giving them dregs and abusing them. And he has this really nasty dog that he sicks on him and stuff. And
how horrible.
One day they overpower this guy and shove him into a closet or something. And then he hears all this construction going on outside. And he goes, what the hell are these guys doing? I mean, this is crazy. And he gets outside and he goes, oh, there's a maze. They built this maze. That's really weird. Okay, well, I can get out of this maze. And so the first thing that happens is he hears his dog, who's been starving to death for the last 2 or 3 days while they've been building this maze. And he goes, oh shit, the dog's out. And it's a really ferocious dog. He goes, oh shit. And he starts running through there. And then he starts getting scraped. He goes, oh shit, they put razor blades in the walls of this maze. And then all of a sudden the lights go out. And that's one of my favorite horror stories anyway. It's like this guy really got his comeuppance.
Yeah, he did. And what a cool ending too. I think my favorite is the tainted meat, butcher shop. And I don't know why.
Taint the meat, but it's the motion or something like that.
Yeah. And I can't get that last panel out of my head with the wife and like the guy's ears and are being sold. So what was your favorite golden age comic book company of stuff you liked looking back at?
Well, I'd have to say quality. I would have loved to have been collecting all the timely comics, but number one, they were scarce, and number two, they were expensive. So, sure, I would love to have gotten Captain America 1 through 10 with Simon and Kirby, but they were almost impossible to come across, and they were already priced up. So when I got into comics, the cool thing for me was quality. I considered quality to have some of the superior artists, actually better than a lot of timelies and a lot of DCs. Buzzy Arnold, the guy that ran quality, really cared about getting decent artists, reasonably good material. And so you got Jack Cole doing Plastic Man. You got Gustafson doing whatever the hell Gustafson did, a lot of odd strips. You had Reed Crandall doing Blackhawk and Firebrand. And a bunch of forgettable characters, but it was Reed Crandall, and there was just really good material in the quality comics, and they were affordable. You could collect Police Comics and Plastic Man, and Hit and Smash and stuff, and Blackhawk especially. I loved Blackhawk, and so each of us, this little group that I keep talking about, we all sort of had our little specialty, and mine was quality. John Barrett's was MLJ's. Michelle's was Meador or Standard, which we all gave her a really hard time about because Standard has the crappiest artists in the golden age, but they had Schomburg covers, so you got to give her that. Jim Buser, I think, was into DCs. Again, a little tougher to collect. It's tough to get those more funds and those adventures and stuff. But and boy, I think there's a lot of DCs that are not very exciting. All Flash, Flash in general in the 40s until Infantino and some of the good guys started doing it. Flash was not a very good comic. It had a lot of humor in it. They didn't take it very seriously. Whereas in quality, I mean, the superheroes pretty much, they took them seriously, So yeah, anyway, so Quality was my company, along with collecting the art, the Frazetta stuff, the Williams and stuff. And then all of a sudden a light went off and said, I should collect ECs. Why I'm going after all these Frazetta comics and other places, and Williamson and stuff. I should collect all the ECs. So by, I don't know, 67 or something, I was thoroughly into collecting ECs and trying to put together all those, which I did eventually. I had a ascending and descending list of all the EC comics, and I keep track of how many I had, how many I still had to go up to. I think there's 302, if I remember right. There's 302 ECs, if you don't count the pre-trend stuff.
You consider the best golden age years from 1940 to 1942. What is it about those years that are so precious as far as comic books go?
Well, for one thing, all the artists were still there before the war took them away. I mean, most of those guys went off to fight in World War II. And so guys like Bill Everett, he's doing stuff in Marvel Mystery up to like Marvel Mystery 33, 32, 33, and he's gone, boom. And he comes back after the war. Jack Cole might have gotten a deferral. He might have worked through the whole wartime. Reed Crandall might have worked through it too, but a lot of guys left. And also there's just the whole early comics, the big logo thing, when they still had the giant, like DC had they call them the big logo issues of Adventure and Batman and stuff, when they had bigger logos, and everything was 64 pages. And there was a lot of all those startup companies. I mean, Centaur was even still around in 41. The only comic book company that managed to go out of business when everybody else was making money hand over fist. Centaur couldn't cut it. I don't know what their problem was. It probably was distribution. They probably had bad distribution. They weren't getting across the country. I mean, that's the primo period, I'd say, 39 to 42. Like you look at Timely just by itself, and by 1943, 44, Timely is a shadow of itself. They still got the heroes, but they don't have very good artists. They've got these second tier artists that are doing Human Torch and Submariner and stuff, and they're not very good. Even Captain America is, got Schomburg, but after you get past the cover, sometimes that interior stuff is pretty bland.
Yeah. You were also into Fiction House, is that right?
Yeah. I just like the whole adventure strip thing, and maybe Fiction House really relates to the pulps pretty closely, and maybe that's part of why I really liked Fiction House, because there's Planet Comics and there's Planet Stories. I mean, they're directly related to each other. They're by the same company. Again, they were affordable. In fact, in Fiction House, when I first started going to conventions in New York in 70, there was a guy back there that had a basement full of Fiction House, and he would bring a ton of them to the show and sell them for, I think, $2 a piece or $2.50 a piece for just about anything. Jungles, jumbos. They were a little dry and sometimes even to the brittle point. So they evidently had been stored in a hot area, but he just had tons of these things. And so what I would do at the end of the show, I was already a dealer at that point. I was always a dealer. I mean, even in 70, we had a table. So I was never, approaching it quite from the fan standpoint. I was a dealer and a collector at the same time, because that's what you had to do. You had to make, if you're going to make money and sell comics and you don't have a job, you better be dealing in comics. But anyway, at the end of this show, this guy would sell me his table for, I don't know what it was, 75 cents a piece or $1 a piece. And I'd haul all these Fiction House back to California. And of course I'd go, well, yeah, I should keep that one and that one and that one. And I slowly started building up a Fiction House collection. Plus, you got Will Eisner and Lou Finan, the very earliest ones. And so that's the beginning of a couple more of the great people in comics. So those are really fun.
Yeah, and Sheena it's really beautifully done.
They're consistent, and it's good girl stuff. And as a teenager, I mean, all that good girl stuff appeals to you. These girls swinging on vines through the jungle. I mean, whatever that.
Yeah, you can't lose. Not with the adolescent boys on that one.
Hey, Steranko liked it, so it must be good, right? Right. He's the man with good taste.
You started selling comics around 1967, and you're also dealing comics in the Rocket Blast Comic Collectors. Is that correct?
John and Jim and I, we were all doing the same thing. We started putting ads into the Rockets Blast and trying to get things for ourselves. Sometimes we put a want list in there. Other times we'd just be selling duplicates, things that we, something, if I picked up some movie comic at the flea market and I've already got a copy of it, well, I'll put it in an ad in the Rocket Splash and see if I can flip it and, buy something else. And the ads were super cheap. I mean, we're not talking about full page ads. We're talking about, 2 inches or 3-inch ad in there.
How much would that cost?
I don't think a page cost you more than $12 bucks, but $10-12 is a lot of money back then. So you could get a portion of a page probably for $1.50 or $2.
I see. And then you can put various things. You would be selling multiple items on that space.
Yeah, exactly. That was the way the business was done back at that time. With everything was through the Rocket Splash or maybe a couple other fanzines, but the Rocket Splash was the main source, and people would just put in little ads and start getting to know other people, and people would put out little lists, and you'd get the list from the guy and buy some stuff. There was all the old dealers, Bill Seuling. And
now, what other fanzines were you into at the time that were going around fandom besides Rocket Blast Comic Collector? I read Yancey Street Journal was one of them, but there were a few, right?
Yeah, well, the Yancey Street Journal came out of San Francisco, so those were almost local guys. That was Bill Dubay, who ends up an editor at Warren at some point. Marty Arbonich, Rudy Franke. Rudy Franke was a art teacher, I think, in San Jose. And he was involved with Voice of Comicdom, which those guys also may have been involved with. And Voice of Comicdom quickly developed and got to be a good fanzine. They started doing Corbin stuff and doing interviews. The best one has got to be Graphic Story magazine. Started out as Fantasy Illustrated, I think, for the first issue or two. And that's Richard Kyle. Graphic Story was the magazine. I mean, that's where the absolute best material was coming out of. They did a little bit of amateur strips. They had George Metzger in there, who was actually a local in San Jose. We all grew up knowing George. And then, of course, George went on to do underground comics. And Landon Chesney, who pretty much stayed as a fan artist, but then they started getting these really good articles. On Wolverton, they did 2 issues on Wolverton. They did an issue on Red Berry, who's still obscure even to this day, but Red Berry was a really good strip back in the 40s. And there was Graphic Story World that Kyle was also involved in. That was more news and stuff.
And then also Comic Reader, Squatron, Spafun.
Yeah, Squatron, right? Spafun those were also the giant ones. Yeah, Jerry Wiest and those guys putting out Squatron. Yeah, those are, for EC fans, that was like, you didn't get any better than those things.
Yeah.
We didn't get them very often, but when we got them, they were great. And by the time when Squatron 3 came out in 69, early 70, I was already dealing stuff. So I was buying copies of that from Jerry Wiest, and reselling them. And that's how I started my fanzine business. That's what I wanted to carry in my fanzine business, was beautiful fanzines like that. But instead, mostly what I was carrying is underground comics, like Zap and, that sort of thing.
Robert Crumb, yeah. And then also Star-Studded, and I have some copies of it, and it's a fanzine. I had read that it wasn't as celebrated as some of those other ones because it was more like their own characters.
I can't speak to how popular Star-Studded was in general, and it may have been more popular in general, but my memory of it back in those early days we're talking about, because it had been around, it probably started before I ever got into fandom, probably started in 63, 64.
Yeah.
But Star-Studded was not particularly cheap. At that point, I think it was cost 75 cents, which was a significant amount of money when comics are 12 cents a piece or even 20 cents a piece. And it was amateur strips. So yeah, it was only for the well-heeled amongst collectors. So I think I got an issue or two and said, nah, I'd rather spend my money on something else. And so I never became a big hardcore Star-Studded fan, although now I'm finally filling in my collection, and of course I know Buddy Saunders really well, and he's part of that Texas trio that put those out. And I appreciate them much more now in retrospect, looking at what they were doing at the time. But at the time, yeah, I wasn't a big fan of amateur strips,
Right.
I'd rather learn about the history of comics. I'd rather see more of the guys I like, the Frazettas, the Williamsons, those guys.
And now, what was the first convention that you went to? Because it wasn't a comics convention, right? It was a science fiction convention. And
yeah, it was the World Science Fiction Convention. It was in Berkeley at the Claremont Hotel in 1968. And a whole bunch of us went up there. And my oft-repeated story about that is that we took our bedrolls with us and we slept on the lawn because, we were 16, we we didn't stay in hotels and we didn't have that kind of money and that sort of thing. So, but it was 50 miles from San Jose, and we wanted to be there for the 3 days. So, and the Claremont didn't shut us down. I don't know how we managed to do that. We must have quietly gotten behind some bushes where nobody noticed us. And I mean, even science fiction fandom, you know, they do tend to look down on comic fans. So we probably were an embarrassment, you know, wandering around the show. I was with a buddy from Gilroy that was more into science fiction than I was. Although again, there was a lot of overlap into science fiction fandom. I mean, I read all the Tarzans years before that, and all the Burroughs books, and I was reading Asimov and Ray Bradbury and you know, the science fiction paperbacks you could buy at the flea market or you could buy anywhere. So you know, we were there for the science fiction part of the show too. But again, we had a table. Four of us split an 8-foot table, so we all had a little, you know, 2x2 section of the table, and we're selling. I think we were mostly selling comics. I don't think we were selling any science fiction stuff. All I remember visually is just sort of stacks of comics. And usually we'd wander off and leave the table to whoever drew the short straw, I guess. And we'd be looking for stuff because there was overlap between science fiction fandom and comics.
Were there some comic stealing going on? Was money from that part of what started your Seven Sons first comic book shop?
The store would have been open by then because the World Science Fiction Con would be Labor Day of '68, and the store opened in March. So we were already established in the store and doing our thing. So we probably just pulled some of our stuff out of the store and took it up there, and we're hustling it and looking for more stuff. And like I say, we all were also science fiction fans. I mean, not as much as comic fans, but you know, we all read, you know, our favorite science fiction people, and we're looking for stuff. So, you know, I would have been looking for Burroughs things for one thing. I love the old hardcovers with Grosset Dunlap hardcovers with jackets of the Tarzans and the Mars books and all that. And so we would have been happily trying to find things like that at the show.
And so tell us about starting the Seven. It's Seven Sons, not Seventh Sons, right?
Yeah, Seven Sons, the count, Seven.
Yes. And tell us about starting that. And who were the Seven Sons that?
So there was Michelle, Tom Tallman, John Barrett, Jim Buser, me. Al Castle was our honorary member. He never actually worked in the store, but he was our honorary seventh son. The joke about him was that he'd steal office supplies from the place he worked and give us office supplies. And 7 was Frank Scadina. You could practically write a novella about the 7 sons. Technically, there was 6 of us, but 7 sounded better than 6. We only pitched in, as I remember, $35 a piece. We only had to cover 2 months of rent. And I think the rent was $75 a month. So we're talking about $150 plus some kind of minor deposit. It was a storefront in downtown San Jose that nobody cared much about. It was off on the side street, same street as the bookstore that we talked about earlier, just a block away from the bookstore, and only a couple blocks away from the San Jose, the campus, which is now San Jose State University, which back then was San Jose State. But San Jose, downtown San Jose was sort of at a low ebb, just like a lot of downtown urban areas back in the 60s. And so, you know, somehow we were able to walk in and rent this place and get a business permit. So all we were selling was used comics, not new comics, but used comics, used science fiction paperbacks. We might have done a little bit with records.
Basically, you'd go to the flea market, get some stuff, take it back to the store and sell it there, right?
Exactly. That was my deal. Yeah. Yeah. And the other guys did a little bit of that, but I still had the advantage of being closer to the flea market. But we all had duplicates. And then stuff started coming in the door. I mean, people would bring in comics and go, wow, these are worth money. And go, yeah, we'll give you 10 cents a piece for them. You know, sure. You know, and so stuff started coming in that way. But that store, technically, for all the hoopla that we do about that store and the fact that we opened up a little earlier than Gary Arlington did.
Is Seven Sons considered the first comic book store?
No. The guy that wrote the book, Dan
Garino.
Yeah. He really tried to pin down what the first comic book store was. And we're early. We're not the first. I mean, depends on how you define a comic book store. To me, at least in my knowledge of just the West Coast, Cherokee Books, where Burt Blum was selling back issues of comics, Cherokee Bookstore was a used bookstore, but they had a mezzanine, and Burt was selling back issue comics out of the mezzanine. It was a place as big as any of our early stores. just happened to be within a bookstore. But that predates anything we did. To me, that's one of the first comic book stores. I can't claim any kind of, fame. I mean, the only thing that we had different was we weren't trying to sell anything else. I mean, we were a pure comic book store, but Bert had much better comics than we ever could approach in either of our stores. He had tons of wonderful stuff, and we'd drive down there, the 6-hour drive from San Jose, and go to Bert's store. Back east, I think Bob Bell may have credit with maybe having the first store. Again, it might have been a thrift store that sort of morphed into a comics and popular culture store. So anyway, no claim on that. The only thing we can claim is that we were the first store maybe in the Bay Area. And Arlington opened a month later. And of course, Arlington kept his store open. Well, financially, Arlington was never really together. He had all kinds of benefactors that would try to bail him out and help him and write checks for him and stuff. But he ran that store for what? Decades, whereas our little store was, came and went pretty fast. I'm always careful to give plenty of credit to all the rest of the guys,
Yeah.
Our timing was just, early, but that's it, For us, the store only lasted for a few months because Frank Scadina was this real case. He was an older guy. He was like 24 or so. He'd had polio when he was a kid, very active physically. He was kind of overweight. His mom really took care of him, and he had never gotten a career, gotten an education or anything. And so when he was one of the guys involved in this. In fact, he was the oldest guy of any of us. Nobody else was approaching 24. I was 16. His mom said, here's a good thing. My son could suddenly involved with this store and he could sell stuff, and he likes comics. He was a big Western fan. He'd read comics in the 50s and he liked the serials and stuff. And so his mom basically bought the rest of us out, which was probably the stupidest thing we might have been doing. But, she offered us more money than we could, imagine. We all got a few $100 out of this store. So we said, sure, okay, yeah, we'll sell the store to Frank and go off and do our thing. But then we turned around the next year in '69, the four of us went to Houston. Jim Buser again, John Barrett, Dick Swan, who had come into our group, and myself. We went to Houston for the first comic book show that we'd ever been to. And we came back from Houston. We bought out a couple guys at tables at the end of the show. Remember, this is still pre-price guide, so everybody's, playing fast and loose on what comics are worth. So we come back with a carload of comics. We go, oh, what are we going to do? Let's open another store. There was no agreement with Frank never to open another store. So boom, all of a sudden we opened another store in the early summer of '69. And that was called Comic World. And that was a tiny, tiny little place. It was actually a staircase for a hotel in just around the corner from our old store. And you could not put your hands out and point your fingers. You had to cup one of your hands. I mean, it was that wide. We're talking, what's that, 5 feet? It was tiny. But the price was right. It had formerly been a place called Bead World, and we were so cheap and unimaginative. We said, well, okay, we'll just paint out Bert Bead and put comic. So it was Comic World.
Work. Yeah.
And Bead World had moved next door, so we got to be friends with those guys. And so bingo, we got a new store with 4 partners instead of 6 or 7 partners. And we did that. We ran that for about a year and a half, something like that.
Why did Comic World end in 1970?
I was starting college and at San Jose State, which was 3 blocks away from the store. And like a fool, I signed up for 18 units. So I sort of thought I probably wouldn't have time to be running a store and taking 18 units, majoring in physics in college. And John Barrett was in his second year. The two of us, John and I, had bought out the other 2 partners by then. So it was just the 2 of us. Things happen fast in these days. Dick Swan and Jim Buser decided they didn't want to be working in the store. They wanted to be doing other stuff. Jim was going off to Stanford. He'd gotten a scholarship, a sports scholarship to Stanford. And so he wasn't going to be close enough to be, commuting down and running this little dinky winky store. We didn't make a lot of money. I mean, we'd have days that we'd make $20, $25. I mean, it was grim. I mean, we were still not even selling new comics then. This was really primitive, So anyway, we just arbitrarily said, yeah, let's close the store. I'm going to be busy with college. John's busy with, he's majoring in photojournalism and stuff. So we just shut it down, when I started college in the fall.
What was your major in college?
Well, it started out as physics, but I learned my lesson really quickly on that and said there's way too much math involved in physics. And then I fell in love with English, but I figured out I didn't know what I could do with English. I didn't want to be an English teacher. I didn't fancy I could be a writer. So I sort of just kept going to college and taking courses, and finally said, well, I guess I should. I'd already started my business at almost exactly the same time. And that the reason I started my mail order business was because all of a sudden I had no money. I mean, starting in '68, I was this little kid with a pocket full of money. You know, I mean, we had a store that brought in just enough to keep us buying comics and stuff. And all of a sudden I had no income and no job. So I said, well, I'll start selling fanzines and underground comics and stuff. And so I did that parallel to going to college. Eventually I just said, maybe I should take business. I mean, that's what I'm doing, right? And so I ended up getting a degree in business administration, marketing.
Was this the beginning of the Bud Plant mail order?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's had different names throughout the years, but that's basically the beginning of Bud's art books, right?
It's all the same business.
It's all the same business.
It just changed names a few times, but yeah, it started out with ads in the Rockets Blast, and then when the Comic Buyer's Guide came along, I started advertising very regularly in Comic Buyer's Guide, and I started putting out little 8.5 by 11 piece of paper with all the new releases on it, and then I started putting in a little catalog with a couple pages and stapled, and then the catalogs got a little bit bigger, and it just, yeah, first it was just me, which is because nobody had made up names back then. You know, you sold a few comics through the mail, you were Bud Plant selling a few comics through the mail, or Terry Stroud or Dave Alexander or anything, you know. And by the time I thought about actually putting a name on the business, I said, well, I'm getting kind of known. I was going to shows, meeting a lot of people, buying a lot of fanzines, selling a lot of stuff, and everybody, you know, in this little world of comics, everybody knew, you're starting to get to know who I was. And I said, I can't change my name now. I don't want to be the comic shop or something. I'm just going to be Bud Plant. So yeah, started out just my name, and then I incorporated it at one point, and it was Bud Plant Incorporated, and then it was Bud Plant Comic Art Company, and then another story. But you know, we finally made it Bud's Art Books, trying to break out of the comic book mode and appeal to people that might also want art books and not want to deal with comic book stuff. Little did I know.
So you got some stuff from the flea market to sell through this, but how did you get also the supply for the underground comics, like the Crumb books and Zap and all that, and selling it through the mail order like this?
Well, the underground comics started with Gary Arlington, because by that point, Gary had been in business for a couple years. I think I went up and talked to him, and he said, yeah, I'll sell you comics at X discount. I mean, comics were, I think, 50 cents. Average underground was a 50-cent book. I think he sold them to me for like 27 or 26 cents a piece. It's like, okay, fine. So I bought a whole bunch of underground comics, started listing them on my list, and started taking them to shows. I mean, starting in 70, I took them to, well, in 69 in Houston, I don't think I was dealing underground comics yet, or fanzines. I think it all started in 70. But by 70, when I went to Oklahoma City and on to New York, I was selling underground comics and fanzines. So I bought a bunch from Gary. Gary came back. The next natural thing was just to go to the comic book companies, which were all the underground comics were in San Francisco and Berkeley. Print Mint was in Berkeley. Last Gas didn't exist quite yet. They came along later. Captain and Company was an early company. They did the Dan O'Neill books. And then Ripoff Press was the big one. I drive up there once a month or something, you know, all through my college years, and pick up restocks of the comics and all the new comics and bring them home and type them out and make out a catalog or a list and get them out to people. And then the fanzine stuff came naturally from going to the shows. You go to the shows, guys bring their fanzines to the show, their new fanzine that they just did. So I meet Jerry Wiest, and I start buying Squatron, and Voice of Comicdom, I mentioned, that was out of San Jose, so that was easy. And all these other fanzines, you pick them up at the show, because that would be their big way of selling them. And all of a sudden I'd have a contact, and I slowly build up those contacts and kept carrying issues of fanzines.
Now, you also published your magazine, Promethean Enterprises, around this time, because that went from 1969 to 1975. And that was with Jim Vadabunker and Al Devoren. How was that distributed and printed, and how did you guys do that?
initially it was through the back door of a print shop. Jim Vadabonker, he might have been out of college by then, and he had majored in business management and decided he hated it. It gave him migraine headaches to manage people. So he went back and started working in a print shop. Boom, all of a sudden we got a back door into a print shop. And so we'd go in and we'd pay some guy off hours. I mean, legal, but you know, the guy would come in off hours and print the magazine for us, the pages, and then we'd run them through we'd do it ourselves. We'd run it through the folder, we'd staple them, we'd cut them. Jim would paste them up and make the plates back when they made plates from things. And so we did it through the back door, and they kept our expenses down. It wasn't until the 5th issue in 1974 that we actually did it sort of officially through the front door and just had them do the whole job, because we printed 5,000 of those, and that was beyond our capabilities. But before that, we were collating them and stapling them and doing all the stuff ourselves. And we were only bringing out 1 issue a year, basically. So it wasn't like a tremendous job. That was the same way I was doing my early catalogs. I just print them up, fold them, collate them, staple them with a little hand stapler, and, you know, keep it cheap. So yeah, also I got to mention, in the first issue, there was another guy, Pat Price. He sort of dropped out after the 1st or 2nd issue, but there was another editor. Al Davron was our key to the underground people, because he was a big comics fan, but he also had gotten to know Crumb in Spain, and he knew Robert Williams really well. And he was an older guy, slightly older guy, had a family, had a car. And, you know, he'd drive to LA and see Robert Williams and go to these shows they put on once in a while, and the Zap shows. And he got to know him. He introduced me to Crumb. So he was our in with all the underground stuff. Whereas Jim Vadabonker and I were more the straighter guys that were more into Frazetta and Krenkel and all that kind of thing. So that's why Promethean ended up being this hodgepodge of underground and overground stuff that we put together.
What year did you first go to the New York Comic Con and meet Phil Seuling?
Well, that was 1970. So it would have been summer of 1970. In 69, we had driven John's father's Ford LTD, which we really abused. You know, we drove it too fast and we spilled stuff inside it and really made a mess of it. So his father said, "I'm not loaning you another car to go to shows." So we didn't have a car. And Michelle had started going to the Seuling cons in 68, and she was driving her own car. But for some reason in 70, she didn't have a car available or something, or she didn't want to use her car or something. So I bought, my first car was a van. I went down to a used car lot with my dad, and he backed up the loan for $2,000, and I bought a van, and we packed it all full of, you know, comics and stuff. And it was either 4 or 5 of us. We were really, we were overloaded already, and, you know, set out for Oklahoma City. July, would have been late June, early July. You know, all determined we were going to have tables and we were going to, you know, sell stuff at the shows.
Right when you met Phil Seuling, what were some of the discussions? What was your impression of him when you met him?
Michelle had been back there 2 years before, and so she had gotten to know Phil, and she had slept on his apartment floor. He had an apartment for his family, had 2 daughters and his wife, and he lived in a place called Luna Park, which was right off of Coney Island. And so Michelle sort of introduced us. So in 70, we actually had, the story is, we dropped off Michelle somewhere because she wanted to go through Arkansas or something like that. She was trying to make sure she went through every state in the United States or something. And so he said, "Okay, we'll meet you back in New York." I think she's going to take a bus back from where she was. It was myself, I think, and John Barrett and Jim Buser. Anyway, we end up at Phil's apartment. We had no place to stay in New York, and we don't get into New York until like 10:30 or 11 o'clock that night. And we go, well, maybe he's up, you know. So we go up to his apartment on the 13th floor, and we can sort of hear a TV going. We go, well, maybe he's up. Maybe he'll put us up, because again, we stayed in rest areas and stuff. We didn't have money to stay in hotels across the U.S. You know, all the money was going into gas and buying a table at a show. So anyway, we knock on the door, and Phil comes to the door in his underwear. He's got long johns on, and that's it. Big hulking guy, a little overweight, you know, real imposing. And he goes, I know you guys are. You're the San Jose guys. Okay, come on in. And that was our introduction to him. He put us up, you know, fed us, took care of us, and then we helped him. We kind of helped him with this convention because he didn't have a vehicle then, and so it was real handy to use our van and drive stuff into the city and drive the stuff back home again. And also we ended up doing security at the show. Once the show opened, he didn't have an armed guard or anything fancy like that, but you hire a couple guys to spend the night in the dealer room and sleep on the floor. Well, that's what we did. It's like, okay, and he probably paid for a night of our hotel or something like that to pay us back, because most of his help was volunteer. It was mostly his students, because he was a high school teacher. That was sort of our introduction to dealing with Phil. But Phil became a mentor to me. I mean, he was an older guy. He was really smart, really outgoing, a life of the party. He knew all the stories, and he knew all the players. He already was friends with Steranko and Gray Morrow and a lot of the early artists, because he met them all putting on shows. I think his show he started putting on the New York show in, I don't know, either 67 or 68. Took it over from Dave Kaler and some of the other guys that had done it. Bernie Bubness, I think.
That was the first one, yeah.
Yeah, and Phil sort of, the show kept growing, by leaps and bounds, but it was still a relatively small show in 69, 70. You got Hal Foster in there, I think, in what, 69?
Yeah, I think Gary Groth went to with his dad, and Hal Foster was there, and I think
you got that famous picture of the banquet.
Yeah, that was the year before, I think, huh?
Yeah, I think that was 69. So I missed that one. But everybody and their brother was there. Jeff Jones, Al Williamson, Gray Morrow. I mean, they were all there. I mean, that was the big event. That was the San Diego equivalent, but back then, on a bit of a smaller scale.
Paul Levitz said that Phil came up with the ideas of panels and programming and structure within a convention. When he went to that 1971, was there a sense that it was more advanced and put together than other conventions you had seen?
Well, we didn't have much experience with other conventions. We'd only been to a couple, really. Mm-hmm. We'd been to Houston in 69 and Oklahoma City in 70. I think the main thing about it was New York was just so much more of a mecca for the professionals. I mean, there was professionals running around, and Phil definitely, I think, developed more events going on at the show. But we weren't as conscious of that. I mean, I spent so much time in the dealer's room. That's mostly what I was doing, was either standing behind a table or out talking to friends and looking for comics. I was not a big guy into going to panels, to be honest. And so I missed out on a certain aspect of those early shows because of that. It was a step up. I didn't really recognize it, I guess, at the time, except I knew that it was the show that we wanted to go to, because we were willing to drive 3,000 miles to go to it, and that was early time. And there weren't other people driving in from the West Coast. That's why we got to stay with Phil, and we got sort of treated a little bit better, I think, because, nobody else was coming from that far away.
Yeah, there's a connection for him too, it sounds like.
Yeah.
So then did you buy product from Phil as well? Did he start distributing toward your Bud's Art mail order? Was there a financial connection also made?
Phil and I both got into wholesale in parallel about the same time. So in 70, Phil might have been doing Wits End. He might have taken over the distribution for Wits End at that point. And he did publish Dark Domain, which was the Gray Moral book, but he wasn't really doing much as far as general wholesale. I mean, there was just this little fledgling business, just like mine was. And we both started, people started coming to us. I mean, guys that had stores and stuff, and said, hey, can I buy copies of a fanzine at a discount? And that's how we both sort of slipped into wholesale. Phil, I would buy Wits Ends from him because he was the guy that was handling the grunt work for Wits End, after Wally Wood had turned it over to John Benson, and John Benson didn't want to be filling orders, so he turned it over to Phil. So this is all pre the direct market. So I have to say that Phil and I sort of grew together, and we started working together. We started going in on fanzines where somebody would come out with, say, the latest issue of Squatron. Benson would do it. We'd say, okay, we'll take 1,500 copies between the two of us, and we'll just split them. Ship half of them to him and half to Phil and half to me. Funny World was that way. I think we co-distributed Funny World, and there was a number of fanzines that were coming out like that. And then when Phil got into the direct market, that was a whole nother scene. And that was one I wasn't really part of, because I was not buying regular comic books and wholesaling them. I tried really hard to stay out of that business. I didn't make it. I still got sucked into it by 1982, but for the first 11, 12 years of my business, I was just doing the fanzines and the underground comics, and that was it. but I was wholesaling them just like Phil was. And also alternative comics. You know, when the Peonies came out with ElfQuest,
Yeah.
they had a really bad distributor at the beginning that totally screwed them over. And they came to me and wanted me to start distributing it. Like a fool. I had already started publishing undergrounds at that point. And I was already doing the First Kingdom. And I said, oh, I already got a sword and sorcery book. I don't need another sword and sorcery comic. And I didn't really fancy myself a publisher anyway. I just had sort of fallen into doing a few underground comics. I did Anomaly, which had a Corbin thing.
And that was taken over by Jan Sternod, right? Anomaly.
Well, Jan started it. Jan started Anomaly as a fanzine,
right,
and did it as a fanzine for the first 2 or 3 issues. And then he comes to me and says, I want to do it as an underground. We could do a lot more copies, be a lot cheaper. And you've got the underground connection, you know, can we do it together? And I said, sure, yeah, you know, because what I would do is gang print it with Last Gasp. At that point, you know, you could walk in, I could walk into Last Gasp and say, I got an underground comic I want to do. So the next time you do one, they're gonna print the covers 4 up, big giant sheet. Well, one of those covers is gonna be mine. And then they print the guts separately, slam them together, and you have an underground comic, and it cost you like nothing. It was like 12 cents a piece or something. It was really cheap to do. And I could do 10,000 or 20,000 copies of an underground. Say 10,000 copies would be $1,200. It wasn't a gigantic investment, and I could pull it off if I could take those and trade them to the other people, to Last Gasp and Print Mint and Ripoff. I'd trade them for the other underground comics I was selling.
I see.
And all of a sudden I have all these underground comics at the price it cost me to print mine. That's how I got sort of into that part of the business. You don't understand what having dredging up 50-year-old memories is like.
Right. That's true. Because for me, that'd be -7. So.
That's right. Yeah. Not much there.
And that's a vacuum at this point. How did you feel when Jack Kirby left Marvel in 1970?
Probably in some ways, my interest in the contemporary comics was not probably as great by 1970 as it was back in 64, 65. I was going to college. I was into underground. I was smoking dope. You know, I mean, there's all this other stuff going on. And of course, Jack Kirby just immediately goes over to DC. So it's like, well, okay, that's cool. You know, I mean, what kind of interesting stuff is he going to, we didn't know what he was going to do at DC. Now, from my perspective, I'm not nearly as big a fan of the Kirby stuff at DC as the Kirby stuff at Marvel. I know a lot of people love the Fourth World stuff and Mr. Miracle and all that, and I can appreciate it, but I don't have the love and fondness of it that I do of Jack Kirby and Stan Lee doing the Fantastic Four and doing the Hulk and doing, you know, all their groovy stuff back in the 60s. So, but I didn't know that at the time. In 1970, it was just, oh, Jack's going to work for another company. Well, that happens, you know. The guys at EC all went over and went to work for other companies. I mean, it happens, and you just move on. And so I didn't really, it wasn't a momentous occasion, I guess.
Right. It was more like turnover, it happens.
Yeah, it happens. And hey, that's going to be exciting. There's going to be Kirby doing #1 comics at DC. That's kind of cool.
From a dealer point of view, it's like you got to get those #1s. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
What was your impression of the Overstreet Comics price guide when that came out in 1970? Did you use it much?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was really crude back then, but still, it was almost the first time anybody put together a guide. I think, Argosy bookstore, I think, had put together something, or maybe a Passaic bookstore. There was a couple funky guides before that. So it was a help, you know, especially gathering some of the information together. Back on the fanzine thing, Michelle Nolan had put together those indexes. She did a Timely index and a Nidor index and God knows what else. And that was where a lot of information would come from. And then Rocket Blast put together specials about Timely. I love the Timely one. I read it over and over and over again, talking about who was in what issues of what, and all these oddball heroes and stuff. And that was where we got our information. But now the price guide started to put that kind of information in. You suddenly find out the first appearance of, Green Lantern, first appearance was an All-American 16. Before that, it was all word of mouth. There wasn't any real documentation on it.
I see.
You know.
So it's also good to find like what was the collector's item too, like what's identified as this.
Yeah, but the early price guide was still pretty crude. I don't know. I'm not sure technically how much we used it. I mean, everybody bought every one of them as they came out, and eventually, you know, we used it more and more. And of course, back then it was probably in some ways a lot more accurate than it is now. I mean, now the market it's crazed. I mean, there's still people, our mutual friend, Jeff Kepley, he talks to me about guide value on something. And I go, well, when I buy comics now, I do it from my gut. I just sort of go, well, what feels like a comfortable price to me? And I don't really look it up in the guide and go, oh, geez, that's, that's not the guide price, because the guide price has become less and less important, at least for the kind of stuff that I'm interested in. The tougher golden age, for one thing, the pre-code comics and stuff like that. But I mean, I do use it, as a basis for pricing stuff. But if something's a guide and a half and I want it, I'm going to buy it. I don't care, and evidently there's a lot of other people out there like that, because stuff's going for crazy money right now. And the guide has become, it could be a general help, I think, on more common comics, but it's become less and less important on the really rare stuff, on the real key stuff, and the really old, old comics.
So tell us about when you went to the first San Diego Comic-Con, like, because Kirby was there. Tell us about that.
Another thing I have very little memory of. All the San Diego Comic-Cons have flushed together, and I think when I think of an old San Diego Comic-Con, I think of the what's the hotel? The hotel up in the hill with the swimming pool that.
El Cortez or something?
El Cortez. I think of the El Cortez, but of course the very first one, but it was in the basement of the hotel. There was only a couple hundred people there. There was like one or two girls. I think Bruce Hamilton's daughter was there. She was like 12 or 13. I mean, it was all guys, all geeky guys, with a bunch of tables, and it was real dark. There might have been panels and stuff, but I kind of doubt it. I think the first one was a little spring show. It was like a one-day show or something. It was mostly just a big room with a bunch of guys selling comics, which is closer to what the early Houston and Oklahoma City shows and Dallas shows were. They're mostly based around the dealer's room, and they might have had some films going on in another room, running serials or old movies or something. So it was pretty basic. There was a few other shows in Southern California. There was a sword and sorcery show put on by Bill Crawford. There was a Disney show. They had one at Disneyland, and the guy actually never paid the Disneyland people for the show. He supposedly ran off with the proceeds and disappeared. So San Diego, the first or second San Diego show wasn't all that unique. It was just happened to be in San Diego. They happened to put on this little show. We had no idea what it was going to develop into. And like I say, there was these other shows that, were popping up here and there. There was a show in Phoenix that we went down to that Bruce Hamilton was involved with. So it was one of several shows that were, we'd go to anything we could get our hands on. There was a show in Portland. Schomburg was a guest at the show in Portland in '73.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And that was cool. I just picked up a copy of his poster that he did for that show. He did the cover of the program book and a nice little poster that drew an original piece for it. And, nice little Portland show. And I'm sure Dave Stevens was there as a kid, doing his thing. So, yeah. And that didn't involve a trip across the country. Those cross-country trips were sort of, epic,
Yeah, that's a big thing to do. But when it's local, it's way easier. And so since they're kind of fused, can you tell the audience maybe one story or interaction with a couple of names before we go into the Comics and Comix kind of vacuum? Jack Kirby, did you have any interactions with him?
My main interaction with Jack Kirby of my memory would be when he did a signing at my table, and that would have been much later. I don't remember interactions with those guys, at the beginning of the early shows.
Do you remember any early stories with Jim Steranko, like from the 70s or so?
Steranko was basically, back then, he was another hustler. He wasn't that much different from the rest of us. He was older, he was smarter and more handsome and a great artist, but he was also a convention hustler at that point. He'd have a table and he'd be trying to make money selling, his history of the comics and anything else he had done. And so Steranko and I got together, sort of like Seuling and I got together, and we'd sell each other stuff.
Oh, cool.
I mean, Sensuous Rosetta ripoffs, we'd sell that to each other, and we were doing business together. Anything Steranko did, I was suddenly a customer of his and buying them for my business. And he would buy, he probably didn't buy very much from me. Probably mostly what I did was buy from him. Yeah. But that's sort of how we got to know each other, sort of almost as peers in that little convention world of doing shows, because Steranko was really approachable. I mean, that. He's really an easy guy to get along with stuff. Yeah. And he was good friends with Phil Seuling. He knew he'd done pictures in Phil's daughter's rooms. He did them a couple drawings that were always on the wall of their bedroom. I remember those.
Yeah, he described Phil as a force of nature. And I remember when I interviewed Steranko, he said that he was going to the Kaler convention as a dealer, actually. So that's true. You're right. I almost kind of forget that aspect of him.
He was imitating, the Captain Company with the Warren magazines with all those ads in the back. Steranko was doing the same thing in Comic Scene and then in previews.
Yeah.
He was get copies of all the really groovy books, doing really nice display ads. If the cover wasn't very good, he'd pick a picture inside and put the sexy girl on the cover, and he was selling that stuff. And so I'm not to compare myself with him, but we were doing, Seuling and I and Steranko were doing a similar thing. We were all hustling that stuff, selling that stuff to an ever-growing fandom.
I never quite thought of him like that, but that totally makes sense. It's clicking now, yeah.
His advice for selling the most material at a show was to have a girl with lots of cleavage working for you behind the booth, and that gets the fanboys to come over and buy stuff. And he's right. Back in those days, I mean, now San Diego, you can't turn around without bumping into a girl with hardly anything, any clothing on. But back in those days, girls were few and far between at the shows, and he'd bring these cute girls with lots of cleavage and have behind his table selling fanzines for him. The other Steranko story, I guess, there's a couple. In Detroit, we had a great birthday party for a guy named Chester Grabowski, otherwise known as the Polish Prick. And Chester Grabowski grew up in Brooklyn and with Phil Seuling and those hardcore New York guys. I think Seuling must have known Steranko for a long time, I think, because they all were really tight. Steranko knew Grabowski really well. Grabowski was just an old, short, feisty guy, sort of like you'd imagine Jack Kirby to be. Short and feisty, and he would carry a pipe with him when he'd walk down in his neighborhood when he was a kid, and if in case a gang attacked him, he'd have this pipe to defend himself. And it sounds like a Jack Kirby story. Huh. So anyway, Chester Grabowski's birthday was in Detroit when we were having this show at the Detroit Triple Fanfare, and Steranko was one of the guests and stuff. And so after they shut down the convention room, somehow we get back into the convention room, which they shouldn't have let us do. And Steranko made up this great sign that said "Happy Birthday to the Polish Prick," and we had this surprise birthday party for Chester Grabowski, and it was Seuling and Steranko and Russ Cochran. And I don't know who else, Barry Bauman probably, because he was part of that group, and a few other guys, but that's the guys I remember. And then afterward, I think they all went upstairs and were gambling. We were playing poker or blackjack poker. It was always poker. Card games in one of the hotel rooms.
Any stories or interactions with Will Eisner?
Well, the first time I met Will Eisner was in the bathroom at San Diego. He had supposedly come by my table looking for me, and that would have been the first time we met. I don't know how I never saw him in New York, but somehow we didn't pop in and get together. But we ran into each other in the bathroom in San Diego. That was probably later on. I don't know if he was going to Seuling conventions probably in the early 70s. He might not have been, because this has got to be later. This could be late 70s or early 80s or something.
And I had read that it was Seuling that invited Eisner to the New York comic conventions.
Yeah. He may have been at the convention, but I never got the opportunity to meet him. So it was later on when I had become better known. I was the guy putting out the big fancy catalogs, and I was carrying all of Eisner's publications, his first graphic novel from Baronet, stuff like that. And so Eisner, at that point, I was higher on Eisner's radar.
Yeah, as a business associate, actually.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, I'm always sort of proud of it that when I was talking to him, I told him that, he'd done a couple good books on how to draw comics. But I said, nobody's done a book on narrating comics, on storytelling comics. He said that's a really good idea, and he ended up doing a book called Comic Narrative, narrating whatever the title was. And I helped him. I also helped him get in with the publisher. He was doing his own how-to books, self-publishing them, and I was doing a lot of business with Watson Guptill. And there's another publisher that does a lot of how-to books, or an imprint of Watson Guptill's, actually, I think, Northlight Books. And I said, hey, I know these guys at Northlight, they do all these how-to books. Why don't you get them to distribute your book? And lo and behold, he ends up distributing his books, and he didn't have to. Him and his brother were handling it. His brother was part of the business. We did business stuff together, stuff like
Nice.
that. Besides the fact that I love his work. I mean, I'm a huge Spirit fan. For
That's
me,
cool.
it was all mixed together, the business part and the
Business. Yeah. That's cool that you're actually able to connect the love of the form with these people, and then as a business venture as well. That's awesome.
Yeah, Seuling and I did the Spirit coloring book back in '74. The story on that is sort of funny. I had not done anything with Eisner at all, but Seuling came up with this idea of taking splash pages from Spirit sections from the '40s and doing it as a coloring book, taking the black and white originals and stuff. And so Seuling came to me and said, "Do you want to go in with me on it? We'll co-publish it." And I said, "Sure, yeah, we can do that." Little did I know that coloring books are crap and nobody wants it. Most comic book fans do not want coloring books. I learned that the hard way by doing the Spirit coloring book. But anyway, Seuling and I, so supposedly we're publishing that, but Eisner put it together with with his printer or something, and it comes out and it says published by Poorhouse Press, which is him. There's no mention of Seuling or I, but we're the guys that put the money up.
Oh, wow.
and came up with the idea. Seuling says, "Hey, Will, this isn't right. I mean, we should be listed in here." So Will prints up these little labels that we're supposed to peel and stick, and we're supposed to put in every copy of it was like 3,500 copies or something we did. And of course, we never did it. I don't know what happened to all those peel and stick things, but I mean, that's the part of the story I remember the most, was like, okay, now we're going to have to open every one of these up
And
carefully.
put those
This little
stickers
peel and stick thing that says distributed in the East Coast by Phil Seuling and on the West Coast by Bud Plant.
That's funny.
So anyway, the thing was a disaster anyway. I mean, over 50 years, you can finally sell just about anything, but just like the last issue, Promethean, when we printed 5,000, I had those forever. And I had Spirit coloring books forever.
You were still in college at the time when Comics and Comix started in 1972 in Berkeley. Can you tell me about the circumstances and the formation of Comics and Comix?
John Barrett, like I mentioned, he was going to school. He was a year older than I was. So he had started photojournalism in college. And what happened with me is that I was still going to the conventions in the summer, whereas John, I think, had stopped doing that. And I needed somebody to run my mail order business in the summertime when I'd go off for 2 or 3 weeks and go to all these conventions, because you got to get the orders out, you got to keep things going. And so I hired John to do that for me. The first time, I think the first summer in whatever it would have been, 71 maybe. When I came back, John says, "Hey, you got a kind of a good little thing going here. I mean, people are sending you money, and we'd send them comics and stuff like that. Why don't we be partners? I don't know if I want to really go into the photojournalism thing. I'm, not that enamored with college. It'd be fun to do something like this." And my attitude was, I'd already been through a couple partnerships for better or for worse. I'd been through Seven Sons for a very short time, and then the other store with the 4 partners down to 2 partners. And John, of course, had been in that partners in both of those enterprises. But I sort of said, well, I sort of got a good gig going. What do I need a partner for? Sort of like running it myself, which could have been a mistake. I mean, maybe things would have been totally different if I had done that. But instead I said, well, look, I'm happy doing the mail order business and I can handle it the way it is now by myself. But why don't we open a store again? But open a real store, a serious store where we need one, instead of opening another store in San Jose where they had Frank Scadina down there, and they had Bob Sybottom, ComicCollector shop was there. San Jose really didn't need another store. We ended up opening up there anyway, but that's later on. But I said, where could we open a store that would be groovy? And we said, well, Berkeley. Berkeley's a natural. It's Telegraph Avenue. It's where all the stuff's going on. There's good bookstores up there. It's a commute from San Jose, but it's an untapped area. Arlington's over in San Francisco. There's nobody selling comics in the Berkeley area. We said, well, okay, let's open up a store in Berkeley. We went up there and checked it out. In fact, when we were walking around, they had just had some kind of protest or something. There was tear gas floating around, and John got dosed with tear gas, not directly, but it was just floating around. And we were on a side street somewhere. We never saw the protest, but he gets hit by tear gas in his eyes, and his eyes are watering and stuff. So anyway, we scout out a location right on Telegraph Avenue, right in front of a bus stop. and say, okay, well, and basically I was going to be the money guy. I was somehow making enough money in the mail order business, and I had stock to sell because I had the underground comics, I had the fanzines, and John may have contributed some money too. I don't know exactly what the situation was on that, but I was going to be the silent backer basically, because I couldn't work in Berkeley and go to San Jose State at the same time. I mean, that would have been impossible. That'd be a 2-hour commute every day. So John said, I'll run the store, you help with the money and the fanzines and stuff like that. So that's what we did. And then we'd met Bob Bierbaum at the shows when we were going back to Oklahoma and Texas and probably New York. I think Bob was back in New York too. And he was another youngster like us, same age, same interests and stuff like that. And so we actually came out to California with Bob because he came out to visit us, because we dragged guys out. We dragged out Bruce Hurgensen he was from New York. We dragged him out to California. And maybe it was after San Diego Con. I'm not sure. It's very possible it might have been after San Diego. And we were saying, hey, Bob, why don't you move out here from Nebraska and work with us in Comics and Comix, be a partner. Bob said, no, I got to go back to school, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, he drives back and he makes it into the Salt Lake Desert, blows his car up, blows his engine out. And the story is that he gets his engine rebuilt from some funky gas station there. And he says, oh, well, that's my tuition money, so I guess I'm not. Now, he may have a totally different version of this. He doesn't usually talk about this part of it. But anyway, so he turns around, comes back to California. His car blows up again in Sacramento. I'm still living in San Jose at this point. So I go up and I tow him back to San Jose, and his car sits in front of my house for the next 6 months or something. And he moves in with me. And slowly he gets a regular job, and then he also starts working in Comics and Comix and buys in as a partner. I think it was going to be like $3,000 was going to be his contribution to buy into Comics and Comix. So he became the third partner in Comics and Comix at that point. One of the big bones of contention is Bob likes to give himself credit for starting Comics and Comix. Well, it just depends on what perspective you're looking at. Yes, he was there at the beginning. Yes, he started it in a general sense, but no, it wasn't his idea. It started with John and I, and started with the story I just told you. And Bob, we brought Bob in,
And it sounds like, as an extension, so to speak, of the mail order business that you already had going.
Yeah, although, I mean, we immediately started selling new comics, which was a step above what I was doing. I mean, by this point, we were smart enough to go to the distributor, because this is probably pre-direct market.
Yeah, 72, yeah.
Yeah, we went to the distributor up in the Oakland area and said, we want to buy comics from you. And we started buying comics at some horrible discount, 25 or 30% off. But, we stocked it with new comics and with the underground comics. And of course, they were super popular with the campus being up there with 25,000, 30,000 students. I mean, it was a great place to open a store. And that was always our flagship store. That was a store, no other store made money. Berkeley probably always made money. And John was a really good partner. He was a really hard worker. I mean, he hustled his butt. And initially he drove from San Jose to Berkeley to run the store. And eventually he moves up there, gets married, and continues to do that whole thing. But the one of the running jokes was, because I had, by that point, even in 72, 73, I was somewhat known in the comic book field, and people would come in and say, where's Bud Plant? Are you Bud Plant? To anybody that was working behind the counter. So Jim Buser finally got a little button that said, I am not Bud Plant. And he, all the guys would wear it, saying a little button saying, I am not Bud Plant. Because as my more and more customers came in and my mail order business grew, I was getting international, well, let's not overblow it, but I was getting a reputation. I was one of the better known people in the comic book field as I was pumping out catalogs and doing ads and all the publications. So I was really well known, and I'd advertise Comics and Comix. So people kept coming and expecting to see me behind the counter. Never. I could barely run the cash register.
That's cool. You guys hosted the 1973 first Bay Area Comics Convention, the Berkeley Con. Is that right?
Well, the first underground convention. We like to call it it's called Berkeley Con. But it was primarily an underground comics convention. And it really was started by, Mike Maniac.
Yeah.
It was started by Mike Maniac. But anyway, Mike and this other guy, they were a couple of Timely fans. And they're not business people at all, but they just wanted to put on they said, let's put on a convention. I think they wanted to do it as an underground convention. I think that was their concept. At some point, they came to us in Comics and Comix and said, this is the way I remember it. You should get Mike's version of this. But they felt like they were over their head. They didn't really know exactly how to continue to proceed to put on this convention. And of course, hey, we're the pros. We've been going to New York for what, 2 years? So we know all about conventions. We got involved in it. And again, so it was their idea and everything. We just, sort of came on board and said, yeah, we could help you guys do that. We could help publicize it. Somebody went up to the campus, to UC Berkeley, and talked them into doing it and said that we'll rent it's the Poly Ballroom. It's one of their facilities up there. It's really close. Again, it's really close to Telegraph Avenue. So you could just walk up there from the store. And we rented the Poly Ballroom, and we had to hand construct the art show the night before the art show. So we had to go out and buy plywood and 2x4s and put the damn thing together through half the night. That was one reason I don't remember much about that convention, because I was on the inside. I was handling, the administrative stuff, letting people in, well, that guy's an artist. Okay, he can come in for free. This guy, I don't know who this guy is, make him pay, and we had to put together the art show, which was nice. John Campbell had become a partner by that point, and Campbell had fallen into a batch of really nice original art. And so we had Hal Foster Prince Valiants and Tarzan pages and stuff on display, but we also had lots of underground stuff, and all the underground artists were really, really happy to contribute. There's a nice little program book. You've seen that little, Berkeley program book. Vada Bonker put that together. That was Vada Bonker's design. And the underground artists all contributed artwork and stuff, and so we did this nice little show, one-off show. There was another show the next year, but I don't think we had anything to do with it. I don't know exactly who put that thing on.
Steve Englehart was at that convention, right? The 73 one.
I think so. Like I say, that thing is a blur. I mean, when you're on the inside trying to put on a show, I never wanted to put on another show, because I said, man, I really did not enjoy the show, because I was trying to run things, make things, keep the trains going. And it was hard. That's it. I'm done. I mean, it's bad enough just to be a dealer and be stuck behind a table, but you're not even behind a table anymore. You're out there trying to fix problems. We went out at one point, and there was some belly dancers doing their thing out on the campus there. Yeah. And we said, hey, you guys we're doing a comic book show. You want to come in and, do your belly dancing at the show? Oh yeah, sure. So all of a sudden we have these belly dancers wandering around the show. Because we didn't have a costume show or anything like that. We weren't not that sophisticated.
But that's the next best thing.
Yeah. Well, everybody had a good time, I think.
Yeah.
And it was a great chance for the underground artists to get a little
exposure,
a little something, because this was still the early days of undergrounds, and there wasn't any kind of cohesive thing going on with the undergrounds at all. It was just a bunch of publishers putting out a bunch of comics.
Interesting.
Even Crumb, we still think that we did the first interview with Crumb in 75 or 74 in Promethean Enterprises in the 5th issue. Nobody else had done any kind of lengthy interview with Crumb at that point. He was still just some weird guy doing weird comics in the undergrounds, and it was not being recognized at all in the real world.
Yeah, you brought a spotlight, or helped put a spotlight on it.
We may have helped put a spotlight. I don't know. You were asking about distribution on the Prometheans, and that was me. I mean, we'd take them into local stores and give them 5 copies on consignment or 10 copies on consignment or something. And I was selling them through the business and wholesaling them, but that's it. And we didn't have any kind of distributor or anything. Yeah. That's why the early issues are all little tiny print runs, 1,000 copies, 1,500 copies.
Was it at this convention that the Tom Reilly collection came through?
Yeah.
2,000 to 4,000 Golden Age comics, a lot of timely stuff that someone had. Tell us about that situation.
That happened at that show, but I was back behind the scenes doing my thing. So I was not there when it actually happened. Everything I know is hearsay, But again, it was Mike Maniac and his buddy. I think they ran into the people first. The people came in with a bunch of comics. They may have come into the front of the dealer's room, and Mike and his buddy sort of corralled them and may have gotten them upstairs or something, gotten them out of the way of the dealers. Because that's like, it's honey to bees, man. I mean, the dealers are going to send all over these guys, bringing in a fresh collection of timelies and stuff. I think they got them up to a room and they bought some of the stuff. Then involved in this, at some point, some of the other dealers were buying some stuff, and then these people started to freak out because they started to realize, I mean, the dealers couldn't hide it. I mean, this was exciting shit. And they were selling this, I don't know what they were selling the books for. It was next to nothing, probably $5 a comic or $2 a comics, or it was probably something like that, you know, something really cheap, you know, for all this fresh stuff. They supposedly started to freak out. And somehow John Campbell, who was a really good, smart guy, and he was at the point of a small partner in Comics and Comix, he talked to him and said, look, you guys should pack these things up. I'll come over to your house and we'll make a deal. You don't want to be dealing with this buying frenzy that's going on here. And so that's what they did. They went back home, and John ended up making the deal for Comics and Comix. I don't know all the dollars or anything about the deal. And of course, nobody knew what a pedigree collection was at that point. The term hadn't even been invented yet. But John got the deal, bought the stuff for Comics and Comix. Of course, we sold them as if they were any other comic book, even though they were really, really super nice condition and stuff. But back then, the value between a good copy and a very good copy and a very fine copy, the spread was tiny. It's a Marvel mystery from the Tom Reilly collection, so it's nothing. But, you know, because this is 73. Price Guide had only been out for 3 years. But supposedly we made good money on the thing, and that was considered the reason we were able to open up 2 more stores. We opened up the second store
San Francisco.
By 74, by a year later, we had 4 stores. We had one in San Francisco, one in San Jose, and one in Sacramento that Scott Maple went up and opened after he had started out in Berkeley. So all of a sudden, you know, we doubled the number of stores we had. Not that that was a good thing, but at the time we thought it was.
Yeah. But tell me about this van accident. It was from Houston to New Orleans. What year was it? And what exactly happened? What was all the chaos that ensued?
This is 73. The bottom line is it was just a car accident. The chaos that ensued seems to be good old Bob Bierbaum and his rewriting of history, and, you know, holding the van accident responsible for a lot of that's come along since then. But basically, I had blown my engine up in my old van, and I replaced it with a new van. So I had a nice, fancy new Dodge van that only had about 7,000 miles on it. We'd driven it to a couple other conventions, I think, and we had gone to Houston and done the Houston show. Sunday night, we packed up, and we were going to drive down to Six Flags over Texas, I think, to check it out. I'd never been there. And I think we were going to continue on to New Orleans and then come back to Dallas, which was the next week. So we had an opening of 2 or 3 days there, 4 days before the next show in Dallas. And then I think New York probably was after the Dallas show. So there would have been, it would have been the next show. So 3 shows in a row. It started raining. I was taking an off ramp from one highway to another, and basically I hydroplaned off the off ramp as I took it, and the van ran into a big concrete pylon that was holding up the freeway. And so Terry Stroud, Dick Swan, Bierbaum, and I were in the van. Bruce Hershenson was supposed to be with us, but he decided to hang out with Russ Cochran, and Bruce actually married Russ Cochran's daughter. So who knows? Maybe that was a good thing. But anyway, Dick's got a whole story which I am not conscious of because I was unconscious. But Dick was just I was just talking to Dick Swan recently, and he ended up going over to a farmhouse that was nearby because it was I guess it was kind of in the boonies, and he got them to call he said he called the fire department. So the fire department came out. I always thought it was police that rather than the fire department people, but I don't know. What I did is I broke my nose. I think I hit the steering wheel in my face, and I was unconscious for some time, or I had a whatever. And when I came to, I was sort of wandering around outside the van. But anyway, Dick had called what I thought was the police, and then they came, and they basically got us down to the hospital, get us checked in. So I broke my nose, and I had cut my chin up, and I broke my kneecap, fractured my kneecap. And Dick had cut himself getting out the window. He says he had to push out the front window to get out the front window and get outside the van. It was pretty good. We must have been going 40 miles an hour or something. And so we impacted the front engine. The front engine just pushed right back into the transmission, into the van. The whole van had a sort of a big curve in the front, where it wrapped itself around this pylon head on to the pylon. Dick says Bierbaum was like laying on the ground screaming, or nobody, I guess it's Bierbaum that says that. I'm not sure whose story that is.
Yeah, I heard that there was some laying on the ground screaming. I read that somewhere. Yeah.
But it was funny because my memory of it was that I don't remember having much impression that Bob was really hurt. You know, he wasn't physically, outwardly hurt compared to Dick and to me. And I don't remember exactly what went on in the hospital, other than we had to call Dick's parents because Dick was underage and we had to get permission to check him into the hospital. And I got my little cast on my leg.
The funniest line from that book you showed me, that talking about this, that someone ran to like a nearby farm and knocking like, help, we need help. There's chaos everywhere. And the funniest line in it was that Texas Chainsaw Massacre luckily wasn't home that day, or some horrible thing. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that was definitely Dick. I mean, he has a very clear memory of, he said he stepped on a nail because he was barefoot, because he was basically about to go take a nap in the back of the van because it was late and been a long day and we were driving in the dark. And so typically the guys in the back, we didn't have seats because we took the seats out. We'd have a load of boxes, usually at least 2 layers of boxes. Then we put a 4x8 piece of plywood in, and people could put a bedroll up or, you know, lay down and sleep. And, you know, it was a funky arrangement. I was driving, so I didn't give a shit. You know, I mean, I was happy. And Beerbaum was in the passenger seat. Anyway, so that's what happened. We got a hold of Russ Cochran, and he came and bailed us out of the hospital. Took us to a hotel and got us a bunch of milkshakes. I remember drinking a lot of milkshakes. And we rented a U-Haul, went down to the junkyard because the van was totaled, unloaded all the stuff in the van and put it in the U-Haul. The U-Haul was a stick shift, and Bruce Hershenson becomes part of the story. Bruce has never driven a stick shift. So I'm trying to teach him how to drive a stick shift, you know, in this big hunkin', you know, 26-foot U-Haul. Because I can't drive a stick shift because my left leg is in a cast, and you don't operate a clutch very well with a cast on.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so we drive up to Dallas, and by that point, Beerbaum's gotten himself a cane. And again, I don't know if we were just being assholes or what, but we were sort of going, what's wrong with Bob? I thought Bob didn't get hurt, you know, and, you know, but now, you know, 50 years later, Bob is still, you know, attributing everything that's gone wrong with him to this accident in 1973. So I don't know, you know, I don't know. I'm not a doctor, but we all hobbled our way into the Dallas show, and these guys are going, "What happened to you guys?" Because we looked pretty messed up, I think, at that point. You know, the classic line for me was that I don't know. I think it was me that said it. The guys were saying, "What are you guys going to do after the show on Sunday night?" You know, in Houston. And I said, "Well, we're going to drive a little ways and crash."
Yeah, you literally did crash. Yeah. So then in late 73, the direct distribution kind of starts. The narrative is that Phil Seuling made a deal with some of the bigger companies, Archie, DC, Marvel, and Warren, to ship comics from Sparta, Illinois. And was it the start of that direct market for the mainstream comic books?
Well, yeah, it's absolutely the start of the direct market. Beerbaum likes to go back and say the direct market started with underground comics, with people like me or Seuling or the underground companies selling to like head shops and the few comic book shops that were around in 70, 71, 72. There weren't a lot of comic book shops then. There was that many, you know, it was few and far between. I disagree. I think that the direct market was absolutely, because Seuling went to, generally I think of it as Marvel and DC, but he must have gone to Archie at some point. He already knew Warren. He introduced me to Warren early on, maybe 70 or 71. And I went over to Warren's and I started buying Vampirilla 6-foot posters and some back issues and some other Warren stuff. So I was dealing with Warren already. So the Warren thing was easy for him, but that wasn't, the direct market was the comic books. Marvel and DC. You know, it could be that the initial shipments may have all gone to him. They may not have even been doing any drop shipping. Eventually, you know, it became a gigantic operation and they drop shipped the comics directly to, you know, the bigger stores, or what they called sub-distributors then. But initially they may have all gone to Phil, and Phil may have shipped them out. I couldn't tell you exactly how that was handled. But basically, you know, comics were not in really good shape at that point in 72, 73. The sales were going down. Other forms of entertainment, I think, were taking away money from the comic book market. So they were willing to listen, and they didn't take it too seriously, but they figured it was another way of making some money, just like selling foreign rights. You know, hey, the British will pay you X amount of money to reprint your books. Sure, it's free money. Well, Phil will buy little tiny quantity of comics, but he's going to buy them non-returnable. And non-returnable is a big thing because the whole returns deal, especially with affidavit returns,
Right.
was a mess. I mean, it was a money pit. You know, it starts out as a little tiny operation. And Phil, initially, this is more of a business thing, but Phil was making people pay up front. So you got a list from Phil of what's coming out in 60 to 90 days, and you had to pay for them in front, which is pretty difficult for little fledgling businesses. That's where Phil and I would have arguments because I believed in giving credit, but I wasn't on the scale that Phil quickly became in the direct market. I was on a little tiny scale. And so I would deal with people. I dealt with Benedict Taschen, the big publisher. He had a comic book store, and I'd send stuff to him on credit, and he'd pay me 30 days later. And that's the way the world kind of works. But that's where Phil and I would differ, because Phil said, no, I want the money up front. Well, that's fine, except when all the stores are cash poor and have no capital, they can't afford to put much money up front. And so it kind of really restricts the growth of the market. Yeah, so Phil started the direct market selling that stuff. And then the whole thing blew completely open inadvertently because new media came along. They sued Seuling for whatever it is, monopolistic market or something. All of a sudden, Marvel and DC started selling to multiple people besides Seuling. Right. And as much as I love Phil, he was doing a really good thing for himself for making lots of money, but he wasn't doing a really good thing for expanding the market and making, comic shops more viable, giving terms, getting more books out to people, getting all these distributors competing against each other. Well, by the time I got out of the distribution business, this is 15 years later, it was like 14, 15, 16 distributors, and then sub-distributors on top of that. That's healthy for the market to have all those people getting books out into the marketplace.
So because his sub-distributors went off and became their own distributors, right? And then that's why there were so many, or one of the reasons. We're going to go back to like 74, but quick thing on Phil that I was going to ask later is, do you think him losing that market the way he did affected him psychologically? Was he disappointed or angry about it?
Oh, yeah. He was real angry about it. Well, for one thing, the new media people were total sleazebags. What they did was a good thing for the world in general, but the people that did it were scum. The guy that ran new media was not a nice guy. I never got along with them, and they were known for pulling shenanigans with people and saying one thing and doing another, whereas the rest of us all dealt on a handshake basis. There weren't contracts between us and stuff. We just would say, my word is good, and this is what we're going to do, and I'm going to owe you, and blah, blah, blah. But new media was something else. So yeah, Phil was understandably upset about it, but he learned to live with it. I mean, he continued to run Seagate, and he was one of a number of distributors at that point. And then unfortunately he got sick. He died in 84. He had a rare liver problem that came along in 83, maybe. It looked like he was getting through it. Wasn't. It was a lot like having cancer. When you get a cancer operation, then it comes back and does you in. He thought he was dealing with it, and then it got him. He died the day before my daughter was born, because I went to call him. I may have told you this story before, but I went to call him because we were still really tight. I had my firstborn daughter, had been born August 20th. And Johnny answers the phone and says, Phil can't come to the phone right now. I'll call you as soon as I can. The next day she calls me and says, Phil's dead. And he died. And I went back to his funeral. And Allison had just been born. And that was the week I think she was born on Monday. And I went to his funeral on Wednesday or Thursday. And my ex never forgave me, for flying to New York when she was still recovering from a C-section.
Yeah,
but,
exactly. He died.
I felt like I had to do it because, the guy was like a father to me, I loved him, and all the people around him that he introduced me to and stuff. So I had to go, and I was really glad I did. We had a really nice little wake and stuff. It was nothing official, but we had a nice little wake, and all his friends got together and swapped stories and stuff. So it was cool.
Sparta, Illinois, was that location basically picked because it's kind of like in the middle of the country and you can ship equally to all the places? Is that the idea behind Sparta, Illinois?
Probably that is true. But this is long before comics. Sparta was probably a printing plant before comics were even started to be produced, but I couldn't tell you for sure. It just happened that they had old cheap presses they could run comics on. And so they became the de facto place where you'd print the comics. You know, to be honest, yeah, Alex, well, Eastern Color, which was Dell,
Yeah.
I don't think those were not printed in Sparta. I think Eastern Color was its own printing company in the East Coast somewhere. So those were in the golden age, those are being printed by Eastern Color. And probably the comics were being printed in these other places. And I'm speculating now, but I think that it slowly consolidated and ended up in Sparta because they needed to keep the cost really low, and they could run them on these really old presses they'd already written off all the costs on, and they couldn't print sophisticated stuff. They did Time magazine and stuff there, but they're not going to print that on this piece of crap press. I mean, when we went down there and visited them, I remember Chuck Rosansky made a big deal out of it because he's going, well, what if these presses break? You know, who's going to be doing the comics? There's no fallback at that point. And then when they started doing the direct market only comics, you know, and doing them all glossy paper and stuff like that, they started coming out of Canada. And that was the second printer. But anyway, so I think it just happened that as comics got consolidated and there was only Marvel and DC and Archie and a couple other Charlton, a couple other comics in the comic companies in the late 50s, early 60s, it all got consolidated down to Sparta, which sort of made it easy for Phil because it's all coming out of the same place. So, and basically he just makes the deal with DC and Marvel, and they tell Sparta what to do.
I've read that when he had gotten this distribution kind of set up, that he had offered you to be a distributor for the West Coast. Is that correct?
No, Phil never pursued me handling comics. I mean, he had the exclusive in the early days, then it got broken open, and I still had no interest in carrying new comics. My shops were, and they were buying from Phil Seuling. And of course, John was after me for a long time. John Barrett was the instigator of trying to get me into the direct market and to distribute comics, because he ended up getting a better deal for Comics and Comix if I was the distributor. But I held out for a long time because I enjoyed what I was doing. It was more of a hands-on operation. I liked the fanzines. I liked the undergrounds. I liked the books. I was carrying a lot more books at that point. I was doing a nice catalog. I had a nice wholesale operation. I didn't really need to be carrying new comics, because with new comics comes along a whole other set of problems.
Yeah.
Making all the comic shops happy, ending up with shortages, with damages. The time factor is a whole nother thing. You got to get those comics turned around and out to the store super fast. And then, of course, there was Air Wars. I mean, they had the whole air freight thing that started up where one of the distributors in the Midwest started air shipping comics, and he got a piece of the market just because he could get the comics to you faster before everybody else reacted.
In 1974, a couple things. You published Barbarian Killer Funnies and Jack Katz's First Kingdom in that same year. So this was kind of toward the end of Promethean Enterprises. How did those get started?
I can't take credit for First Kingdom, at least in the beginning, because that was actually Comics and Comix. Bierbaum was a part of Comics and Comix at that point. And actually, Comics and Comix was trying to do distribution on undergrounds. Once again, John was thinking, well, this is a way, if we could publish some stuff, we could trade with the publishers, get comics cheaper, make more money on them. And so Comics and Comix said, we're going to publish. And they talked to Jack Katz, who had become a customer of the Berkeley store. I didn't know Jack from anybody. They did a Dan O'Neill. We did, I think, 2 issues of Dan O'Neill. I'm saying I'm sort of differentiating myself from Comics and Comix, because this was really more of their deal than mine.
Yes.
But the Jack Katz thing and the First Kingdom was the long-term project. And they actually did that for the first 6 issues. Yeah, meanwhile, I had done Barbarian Killer was my little puppy. That was a guy down in Santa Cruz. So I would go over and see him, and we were going to do, it's a Conan parody. So I thought we'd do that. And I did Anomaly. And then we had one of the guys in the store that was managing our store, Jim Pinkowski. He wanted to do a comic called Spaced or Spaced Out. And so we were the imprint on it, basically, and provided the distribution, but I think it was his money to do that. And then we also did, Comics also did Magic Carpet.
Right, that's Alfredo Alcala, right?
Alcala, yeah.
And that was from 77 to 78 or so. Did you interact with him much?
Moderately, yeah, because we had a close friend, a mutual friend, Manuel Aud, Auad, who's now an art book publisher in San Francisco. Manuel's Filipino, and he was a big comic book fan. He is a big comic book fan, and he knew Alfredo from the Philippines. And so Alfredo needed a place to live when he came over to the U.S. to start doing comics, and Manuel put him up in his basement for a couple years. And so I got to know moderately well. I got to know Alfredo through that. Alfredo was a big fan of the classic illustrators like Frank Brangwyn. And he used to buy comics from Vada Bonker and I when we were dealing in antiquarian books with Frank Brangwyn and some Dean Cornwell and some of the classic illustrators. A lot of the artists have studied those guys, you know, including Steranko. If you talk to him about those guys, he'll probably name them all off to you too.
I see. So Alcala had kind of known you guys already from other things.
Yeah. And I forget exactly how that comic came together, but it, you know, probably Manuel had something to do with that too. They, you know, he wanted to do a comic. He figured there was some good money in it because the comics were making money. We could do 20,000 copies, front somebody, I don't know, $1,000 or $2,000 for it, which was good money back in those days, especially for comic book artists, and basically pay them a royalty on the sales. First Kingdom was done a little differently, but the First Kingdom, we basically gave Jack $100 a week for like 11 years. His wife was really supporting him, but he was able to do this thing and have a regular, you know, small income from it because he was only doing one comic every 6 months. So, you know, that was the big problem with the First Kingdom. By the time a new issue would come out, everybody's forgotten what was in the last issue. So I finally talked him into starting to have a synopsis, and we'd have a guy write a synopsis for us in each issue. So the poor readers get brought up to date after 5, 6, 7 years of this story. I took it over from Comics and Comix basically when they finally decided that publishing comics was not their gig and distributing stuff was not their gig. And so I said, well, that's fine. I'm already sort of in the business. I'll take it over and distribute it.
Well, in 1975, the partnership kind of splintered a little bit because Beerbaum left and started Best of Two Worlds, I think in San Francisco or so. What was the circumstances of this kind of partner splinter?
That's complicated too. And there's different versions of that. Basically, at the time, there was irregularities coming along in the Berkeley store where John Barrett and Beerbaum worked. As far as there was money occasionally disappearing out of our safety deposit box there that we couldn't account for. We had a store within a store. We had the old comics within a store that we had built within the new store, the big store. And so our antiquarian stuff was there. And it was good because it was easy to police it. There was always a guy behind the counter there. So that was 2 people at the counter. There was sort of irregularities going on. Beyond that, I can't tell you too much detail because, again, I wasn't working in the stores. But at one point, John Barrett comes to me, says, it's either Bob or me. I cannot work with this guy anymore. I mean, there's just too much weird shit coming down. He's doing trades for stuff he says is good for the store, but nobody else is there privy to the store. He trades some stuff of his own for stuff that he wants from the store for himself. And there was the cash discrepancies. When John says it's either him or me, I said, well, it's got to be John because I've known John, you know, for much longer and I trust John. And okay, you know, that's it. John's my guy. So we had this very acrimonious split up. At that point, we had another partner, this guy, John Campbell. He was working in San Francisco, running the San Francisco store. So we had this acrimonious split up, and it got so nasty that Bob was trying to force us to go into every store and split up every piece of property in every store, which would have been insane. There was 4 stores, you know, to go through and say, okay, you get this book and we get this book and you get this book, you know, because we were trying to work out something much more smoother. Bob, how much money you want? We'll buy you out. You leave, we're done, you know. So we started actually splitting the stuff up, and then we finally said, this is not working. This is ridiculous. This, you know, and we bought him. We pushed him out of the business. However, we did that. He was a minority stockholder, so basically do what you wanted to, I guess. And we gave him money. I think we gave him, I don't know how many $1,000s, but we bought him, forced him out, bought him out. Then later on, the story comes out, this John Campbell had developed a cocaine habit, and he ended up ripping off his folks who had a chain of, medical chain they were involved with, and he was ripping them off He admitted to staging a robbery in one of the San Francisco stores, at least one, maybe two break-ins that we thought was a Chinese gang. They came in and broke the window, snatched and grabbed a bunch of comics and left. He admitted to doing that because he was going through, at this point, a AA thing where, you know, you own up to what you did and come back and admit it. Well, so at that point, Bierbaum says, well, it was all John Campbell. You know, you guys threw me out of the store and it was all John Campbell's fault. I didn't do anything wrong. Well, you can see where the problem is. You know, I mean, John Campbell is now dead. John Barrett is now dead. You got Bierbaum and you got me with our two different stories, you know. But, you know, I still insist that there was more to it than Campbell. I don't think Campbell set Bob up for the fall or anything. I think there was still, I know Bob well enough, I'm afraid, and Bob has screwed people over the years. He's done a lot of shady stuff. And I think that he was doing shady stuff. I'm not saying he did anything, one thing in particular, but he did enough to make John Barrett say, I don't want to work with him anymore. And John was my guy, you know, so we had to make a decision, and that's what pushed Bob out. And so there was a very acrimonious competition going on between us for years after that.
Mm-hmm.
And Bob proceeded to open up more than one store. He opened up in San Francisco, and then he came back to Berkeley and opened up a Berkeley store, which eventually I think became Rory Root's Comic Relief, or maybe it just, Comic Relief may have came along because Roy Root did work for Bierbaum. He was Bierbaum's guy. And when Bierbaum went bankrupt on me, and he still owes me a whole bunch of money, which I'll never get, but he blamed it all on Roy Root. He said, oh, Roy was buying too many comics. Well, Bob, my deal's with you. You know, I'm not dealing with your manager. I'm dealing with you. You owe me money, you know, but he goes bankrupt. And, you know, I stayed friends with him as much as I could up to a point, and then I finally gave it up.
Yeah, the interesting thing is how you guys talk about a lot of the same comics and historical perspectives and history of books in general, not just comic books, and artists. And there's such an interesting overlap, but there's still a certain basic nature that seems to have caused a divergence, and such a fascinating thing, actually. Okay, so then Groth had started Fantagraphics, the comics journal, and there was a time in I think the later 70s, they were kind of low on money, and that you may have bought in at some point. What was that story?
Yeah, actually, I think Comics Journal didn't start out as a nostalgia journal.
Right, that's right.
I think that was started by some guys in Texas or something.
Yeah, he took over, yeah.
Yeah, and then he took it over and turned it into Comics Journal. I mean, what a great publication. It was as important to fandom back in those days as, to me, as the Buyer's Guide might have been, you know, or the Rocket Splash might have been. I mean, it was a real center point of interviews with people and trying to elevate comics to a higher level, you know, doing serious criticism and stuff like that. Anyway, he was doing a good thing and doing a good magazine, but he had run into financial trouble. And he came to me, and it was so much like John Barrett when he came to me in 1971. Hey, do you want to go into a partnership? I mean, do you want to work together? And once again, somehow I begged off and said, no, I don't really want to be a partner in Fantagraphics. I mean, that's a little bit beyond me. But look, how about if Seuling and I start guaranteeing to take your print runs? And at the same time, I think he might have been switching to a new format, because I think he might have had the first color cover on the next one he was going to put out. It was a Gil Kane or a Star Wars cover, something like that. I think it was Comics Journal. I think it was 37.
Oh, okay. Okay. Uh-huh.
I think it was 37. Up until this point, Seuling and I were getting away with buying big chunks of print runs, and eventually we'd sell them. So even if we couldn't sell the comics really fast, as long as it didn't financially screw us up, we could say, okay, we'll both take, I think we both took like 1,500 copies or something. So we basically gave them the money for 3,000 copies and said, we'll take them no matter what. You get the money and you can keep publishing, and you don't have to try to figure out how to sell these things and how to get paid by all these people and stuff. We'll take them. And so we just started, you know, splitting his print run like we had done on Squatron and some of these other fanzines. I don't know how long that went on. It got him through his rough patch, basically. So that's basically the story. But Gary's been real nice about it. He said at one point that we sort of saved his bacon, because I know he's gotten into financial trouble a couple times. They had to do a GoFundMe.
Right. But and I asked him about that, but luckily the community and the readers, he's developed such goodwill with everybody that people would come in at these times to help him out, which is awesome because we all benefit from what he produces.
True, absolutely, yeah. So we just sort of did our bit to help him out then, and it worked out fine. And we didn't have to become partners.
Right.
Who knows how that would have gone.
1980 to 1985, Comics and Comix published Comics Trade Journal, Telegraph Wire. What were these about exactly?
Well, the Telegraph Wire was an in-house publication that we'd sell to customers or give away to customers. And of course, Diana Schutz was the editor for the longest time. And because we had that at that point, I don't know how many stores we had, 6, 7. We had enough stores that we could get away with doing something like that. And it was a good promotional vehicle for saying there's going to be an event in this store, an event in that store. There's going to be a signing here. We're going to have discount days here. And we could distribute it through all the stores. And we could print it. It was just a little newsprint thing. In fact, I just came across a batch of them. I didn't know if I still had a good collection of them, but now I know I got a good little stack of them from somebody. I think Diana, I mean, she did like she'd go to a show and go to a convention and then talk about it and do stuff like that. I mean, she was the best thing that happened to it. That was great. But yeah, so we did this little in-house publication. Diana's from Canada. And she, again, keeps going back to me refusing to have people work for me. Diana wanted to get a job with me or something, or wanted to get a job in comics. I think she corresponded with me. I don't know if she wanted to work in my warehouse or that may not have been the case. But anyway, she needed a green card. So basically we did what we need to do sent the Canadian government some kind of note and said, yes, we'll provide her with a job in Berkeley. And we got her a green card so she could come down and work in the shop in Berkeley. And so, yeah, she was a real asset to Comics and Comix for a long time. And then, went to work for Dark Horse and became a well-known editor.
In 1982, so this is the distribution stuff starts off now. In 1982, Charles Abar's distribution, this was in the West Coast. And did you buy his distribution or did he owe you money and then just gave you the business? How'd that work?
No, I bought it. You really did your homework, Alex. You got this stuff down pretty good.
Oh, good. Thanks. I tried.
What happened with Abar is he was a small distributor in the Bay Area at that point, mostly distributing, I think, in the Bay Area down to Santa Cruz and stuff like that. At the same time, he had a full-time job. He was running a delivery truck for either the San Francisco Chronicle or the Examiner, working like crazy because he's a workaholic. The story is his wife put down her foot one day and said, Charles, you got to choose. Do you want to be a comic distributor or do you want to work at your mail delivery job? Because he loved that job. He'd get up, early in the morning, and he was the guy that was throwing the papers to the paper boys, and back in those days when they had paper boys and liquor stores would get the delivery of the paper early in the morning and stuff. And he said he really liked it. He still drives a big truck like that. Well, he just retired, but he had a supplies distribution business up until recently. So anyway, his wife gave an ultimatum, because he was just not at home enough. And so he said, well, okay, I'll get rid of the distribution business. And Charles, he's not a guy that's really motivated highly by money. He's motivated more by loyalty to customers. And he really felt strongly that he wanted to protect his comic book stores that had been dealing with him for years and make sure they were taken care of properly. And for what it's worth, he chose me to be the, the recipient of the business. So, I mean, I bought the business from him for a nominal amount. I think it was $5,000 or something. It wasn't very much. It bought me all those customers that he had because he had faith that I would take care of his customers properly and not screw them over, raise prices, do a bad distribution job, whatever can happen to a distributor. So, I sort of got handpicked, and that put me into the distribution business, which I had tried really hard not to get into for all those years. As I told you, John was pushing me to get into it. And all of a sudden we started getting semi-loads of comics up in Grass Valley and breaking them down and we started running a van route with my old white van, the van I bought after the accident in Dallas, Texas. That was now running a van route down to the Bay Area, all the way down to San Jose, I think.
Cool.
It was like a 14-hour route. It was just terrible.
The van that crashed, was that the one that you drove to the East Coast in?
The van that crashed was totaled. I had to buy a new van in Dallas.
Right, after. But before the crash, when you went in 1970 to New York, was that, you were in a van then, was that the one that ended up crashing?
No, the 70 was my first van. It was an old tradesman, used tradesman van. The engine blew up twice.
I
The
see.
first time the engine blew up, my dad and I fixed it. My dad's a mechanic, right? So he teaches me how to rebuild an engine. Engine blows up. Something blew up the second time. Coming home from a San Diego con, we break down in Thousand Oaks. We get towed to a Dodge dealership. And while I'm trying to figure out what's wrong with the van and what's going to cost, and I need to get back to school the next day, John Barrett is out talking to the guy selling new vans, saying, "Yeah, we need a new van." So they ended up buying my whatever they gave me for my old van, and I ended up once again my parents, backed me for $4,500, and I bought a new van that we totaled in Houston. We had a lot of car issues.
Yeah, that'd be an interesting comic strip, Bud's Vans, just kind of a different kind of
adventure. I think they're more memorable a lot of times than stuff that was going on at shows, is when you're out in the middle, the middle of the night, you just had a tire, cut its way off the rim, and you're going, okay, how are we going to keep going? We had one trip we had to get from New York. We stayed too long in New York after the show, and we were driving to Dallas, 36 hours straight. We drove right through the night for 36 hours. And by the time we were at the end of that, I was taking no-dos, which I don't recommend. We didn't have any whites. I would have taken whites if we had them, but all I had was no-dos. That was the trip. That may have been the trip that we lost 4 tires and 2 rims in one trip.
Oh, okay.
Unbelievable. And then I ran the van into a curb and lost a rim and a tire. I mean, almost in Dallas for the show, and I ended up, here we go again. There's another tire shot.
So this crash was really a sequence of van misadventures. It sounds, now that we have a context here. 1984 then. So now, okay, first, did you enjoy the distribution business as you were getting those routes going?
Yeah, I suppose I did. It was fun getting the new comics, setting up the accounts. I've already was dealing with a lot of these guys, so I was dealing with the same guys I knew, just for more stuff. So it was sort of exciting in that way. I mean, it said we'd have the semi would drive into Grass Valley, and we'd break down the comics right in the parking lot and figure out who was all the stores and put their orders together, package them up, and send off. It was Paul, this guy that worked for me, in my van, and he'd drive this really long route. We'd hand deliver the stuff to every store. I mean, that's why I say about service. I mean, look at what goes on now. Diamond's back in Mississippi, and you pay for the freight, and you get lousy packaging, and you get damage, and you get shortages and stuff. Back in those days, we were hand delivering this stuff to these people. And then to be competitive with Capital decided to open a warehouse. They had distribution in the Bay Area. In fact, they were using Bob, I think, for part of it. Bob was a sub-distributor.
Sub-distributor, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, they decided to open their own warehouse in the Bay Area. And at that point, from a business standpoint, I said, I have to do the same thing. I can't continue to service guys from Grass Valley. I'm too far away. So both of us opened up warehouses within, 15 miles of each other. But then we also had a warehouse where stores could come in and restock stuff. We had these beautiful displays of fanzines and books and overstocks on comics. We'd buy extra comics all the time, which can be good or bad, depending on how good a job you do. But we'd have all that stuff available so stores could come in and restock themselves. And there was 2 stores in the Bay Area. Now there's Diamond in Mississippi. So, I mean, things have changed dramatically.
The landscape's different.
Yeah.
And now just some background on 1984. So Pacific Comics started as a mail order retailer, and it got into West Coast distribution and publishing. And the publishing end was doing pretty good. A lot of people know about Pacific Comics and Jack Kirby and the stuff that they were putting out. But the distribution end lost too much money, and they owed several hundreds of thousands of dollars. So how did you acquire them in 1984?
Yeah, one day Bill Shanis calls me up. Now, he was at a sub-distributor at that point for me for DCs. DC did not want to set up accounts with everybody and their brother. They only wanted a hand-picked selection of people that they really felt confident in to sell DCs to. And so as a result, somebody like me would sell them to Pacific, and we'd sell them to, there was an outfit up in Seattle. I think Second Genesis may have been direct with DC, but we'd have what they call sub-distributors. Alternate Realities, which was Chuck Rudzansky, I sold him as DCs. DC didn't want to set up Chuck Rudzansky for some reason. They just wanted to keep this they believed in having a really close-knit group of distributors. And then we'd we could have meetings together and it wasn't like 14 guys there, half of whom they might not like, I guess, or something. So anyway, Pacific's buying my DCs from me. So they're building up the deals, money on DCs. And anyway, Bill calls me up. They owed me $26,000, which doesn't sound like a lot right now, but in 1980, what was that? 84?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a lot of money then.
1984, $26,000 was a lot of money. Yeah. And he says, we're going bankrupt. We can't pay you, but come down and you can have the business. Basically, you can step into the warehouse and you can have all the accounts. And that was his way of taking care of me, because Bill and I were friends. It was all a handshake business and we trusted each other. And, nobody wanted to screw the other guy if we were decent people. I went down there. Bill introduces me to the accounts. I mean, he shows me the warehouse. He turns over the keys to me and says, you need a manager down here because I'm leaving. And you should go get Ken Kruger. Ken Kruger, meanwhile, they had sent him back to Sparta and they had a warehouse in Sparta in an old firehouse. And poor Ken, all the comics they got, they had to go up something like 42 steps upstairs into this firehouse and break all the comics down and then get them back downstairs. Ken said it was a horrible, horrible setup. He doesn't know why they ever bought this stupid firehouse, but that's what they did. So anyway, Ken's the guy from LA. Ken was involved at the beginning with San Diego Comic Con. I mean, Ken goes back into science fiction fandom. He knows all the players. He knew all the accounts in LA because he'd worked with them before for Pacific before they sent him to Sparta. So I call up Ken and say, here's the deal. I just inherited Pacific's distribution business in Southern California. Will you come out and, in management? You want to move back to California with your wife and the two boys? And he says, oh yeah, I do not want to live in Sparta anymore. So he had bought a big house. It was supposed to have 13 rooms or something and 3 stories. And he had filled it all full of all his sludge because he just loves to accumulate stuff. And he got in his car, drove out, took over my warehouse and made the boys and his wife, Penny, pack up everything in a semi and have the stuff brought out in a semi trailer. And then they all ended up working for me. Penny worked for me in accounting, and the 2 boys helped in distribution. Plus, we had a bunch of other guys there. It was a big warehouse. There was a lot of distribution going on there. So I owe Bill Shanus a lot, actually, because that really increased the size of my distribution business, which eventually resulted in me being able to sell to Diamond. And by that time, Bill Shanus is working for Diamond. So again, who am I going to sell to? I'm going to sell, Bill Shanus basically handled the negotiations between Diamond and me up to a certain point. And again, I trust Bill. He took care of me when times got tough, He introduced me to driving the route down to San Diego. They'd break up the comics in LA and then somebody'd have to drive to San Diego. We hand deliver them to everybody down in the San Diego area, which was another, it was a lot of work.
Did you also inherit the debt that he had too?
No, I didn't get the debt. And in fact, they had a liquidation sale, and I went down and we would bid on stuff. And I bought a whole load of stuff from there, did liquidation. And in fact, the interesting thing was, as far as the bankruptcy went, technically they never went into bankruptcy. They couldn't pay their debts, but to go into bankruptcy, usually somebody has to force you into bankruptcy through the courts. Marvel just wrote it off. DC wasn't distributing to them anyway. Marvel, they owed Marvel, I think, if I have the number right, it might have been $400,000, but I could have the number wrong. So don't count on that. But Marvel just wrote it off. They just, cost of doing business. Same thing happened with Alternate Realities. Alternate Realities, when they went down, they owed Marvel a shitload of money. Marvel didn't pursue it again. They just figured it wasn't, it's like getting, blood out of a stone. They figure the guys are going bankrupt anyway. Why hire a bunch of expensive lawyers to get nothing? So
that's interesting. That's cool.
Alternate Realities did the same thing. They just liquidated their stock. Chuck Rosansky tried to take care of me as much as he could. He owed me a lot more money than Pacific did. But all of a sudden, when I inherited Alternate Realities, I was already in the process of selling to Diamond. So it was like, I don't really want Alternate Realities. But he calls me up and says, I owe you a shitload of money and I can't pay you. Okay, I guess I'll take over your warehouses.
That was in 1987. So when you acquired the Rosansky's Denver-based Alternate Realities, how much money did they owe you at that time?
They owed me $180,000.
Okay, so that was more than the 26,000 from Pacific. And also, Alternate Realities is listed as Nanette Rosansky's
Yeah, yeah.
But it was actually
Chuck,
Chuck's, huh?
well, it's a matter of opinion. Chuck claimed it was Nanette's company, but I think Chuck merely did that like a lot of corporations do. They try to decrease their
Income.
I hadn't thought about that, but liability.
Okay.
Like the comic book companies used to have all these different imprints. Theoretically, if one went out of business, then
Yeah.
that's gone.
That's
But
how, yeah, that's how Timely was. Like,
yeah, it hasn't
there was
hurt
a lot of
the
different
main,
companies.
the
Yeah.
flagship. And so for Chuck, I mean, I guess he didn't want to risk Alternate Realities bringing down Mile High Comics.
I see.
And so he establishes Nanette as a separate corporation. And if anything happens to her, it doesn't affect Mile High Comics. They don't have to end up paying off the debt.
You and Midwest distributor Capital City used Seagate's old space in Sparta, Illinois, right? When you took over Pacific, right?
No,
Okay, because I read that somewhere. So that's false then.
no. The warehouse that I just mentioned, the fireman's place, that was
Yeah.
in Sparta. And that was purely Pacific's warehouse. That had nothing to do with Capital City.
Now, also in 1985, you were named by DC Comics and the company's 50 who made DC great. Is that right?
Yeah.
What was that credit for? Was that because you were distributing DC Comics?
To my mind, I think what they were doing, they were trying to include somebody that represented comic book stores, the fans turned dealer, or the new way of selling comics. They had Seuling in there. So he was the direct market guy. And I was the sort of the next step out between the direct market and the customer. I was the guy with a bunch of stores.
I see.
And getting comics out. So
I see.
Because I think we may have had the largest chain store operation at that point, since we had 6 or 7 stores, and plus I was a distributor and everything. So I was high on their radar, I guess.
You have a great reputation. I think everyone who's dealt with you, it's always been that you were a straight shooter.
Except for Beerbaum.
Right. There's always been a commentary that you were always honest in the dealings and that you were always fair. Everyone that I've asked about, minus one person, has said that.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
In 1987, now I read this, that, when you look up WonderCon, it says that it was conceived by John Barrett around 1987. Do you know anything about that backstory?
No, I don't know a lot about it. I know John was definitely involved heavily with it at the beginning. I think was Mike Friedrich also involved, the guy from Star Reach?
Yeah, Star Reach guy. Yeah, I'm not sure. Mm-hmm.
I know John was involved. That in '87 he was still part of Comics and Comix, but the stores weren't really involved with the convention itself.
And by 1988, which we're going to talk about 2 main events here, Bud's Art mail order was still its own separate thing this whole time.
No, up until '88 they were blended together.
Oh, okay.
I was still doing the mail order retail business, but I also was doing distributor business.
Oh, okay. So
it got to be a problem because when you're wholesaling and retailing, a wholesaler can come in, or a customer that I'm selling wholesale to could come in and want to buy all the copies, and it's like the one business kind of stealing from the others. If I sell all those 10 copies to this store, that means I got some customers, retail customers, that won't get it. So there was a little bit of an issue there. And honestly, you may have read this, that the retail business by that point, by '88, was about 3% of my sales. I was doing $12.5 million a year. You can see that retail was that big and the wholesale was that big. So the retail had gotten sort of neglected because I had to deal with the business that was bringing in all the money, which was the wholesale business, and deal with all those issues. And I wasn't spending the time on the retail business like I used to. So what we did is, in preparation for selling to Diamond, we broke the 2 businesses off and actually physically separated the retail business into another location just for an interim period, so that it was a nice clean separation. So I could sell the wholesale business to Diamond, but I still got this little retail business that I'm going to fall back on and make, continue to operate. And eventually we moved that business back into our primary location because Diamond didn't need a warehouse in Grass Valley. They just operated it for a few months where they had to, and then they bailed out on the location, and I moved back into it. I was actually a Diamond employee for a few months.
In 1988, you sold your distribution business, which we've alluded to a bit already, to Steve Geppi.
At one time, let's see, this was once I was a distributor. Capital Distribution and I were the two distributors in the Bay Area. And we had an agreement we wouldn't bring in air freight comics because it was going to cost more money. You know, it was going to cost a lot more to air freight stuff than stick it on the back of a truck and bring it out on a semi. What happened was Capital got a really good deal from TWA or one of the airlines. And overnight, they broke our agreement and started air freighting stuff in, which in the long run was not a big deal. But in the short run, it was a huge deal because all of a sudden, the stores that buy from them are getting the books a week earlier than my stores are. And so I had to go into the air freight business. That's the reason that I sold my business to Diamond and not to Capital, because I didn't trust Capital. Nice guys, I'm friends with both of them, but when they broke that agreement, that was a red line for me. And I said, you know, so when it came time to sell the business, you know, I said, can I trust these guys? No, you know, they broke this agreement that we had, you know, just to get a little bit of a foot up on some of the Bay Area business. So I went to Geppi because I trusted Geppi to come through on, you know, what we were talking about and to keep it quiet. When you're selling a distributorship, you don't want all your accounts to know you're selling the distributorship, because then another distributor comes along and says, oh, well, you know, you don't want to deal with Geppi, or he's not going to carry adult stuff anymore because he's not into that kind of stuff. And you better deal with us. And, you know, there was a lot of competition. There was a lot of competition from a discount standpoint and a time standpoint and everything. And you're really careful because the negotiations took a long time to sell. I had to sell 7 warehouses to Geppi, you know, and it was a big deal, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. You basically decided who was going to win the end.
Well, I didn't know that.
You didn't know that at the time, but that's basically what you did. You chose who gets to win.
Yeah, little did I know. Yeah, if I'd sold to Capital, that things might have ended up differently. I'm not trying to give myself credit, but I was the 3rd largest distributor at that point.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Yeah. I think Geppi was number 2 and Capital was number 1. And that put Geppi into the number 1 spot.
That's right.
Still,
That's right.
It still might have ended up the same. Who knows?
Geppi, when I asked him, he said there was a dinner that you guys were at together discussing this. Do you remember the details of this dinner?
Was that in Chicago?
Maybe. I don't know the city. I don't remember that part.
We might have started that in a discussion at Chicago. So it might have been during a Chicago con, and we went out to dinner together and we're talking about it. I don't have a real clear memory of that. I know at some point I got Steve Geppi out and he came to Rough and Ready, where I was living at the time, and visited the farm and everything. And that was sort of fun.
And why did you sell?
I was basically headed downhill on the business at that point. Comics and Comix had been poorly run. Whether you can blame me or blame John Barrett and the guys that were running it, Comics and Comix at that point had a negative net worth, and they owed me well over $2 million. So I had Pacific wasn't so much a problem. That was earlier, but Alternate Realities goes down owing me $180,000. Now Comics and Comix is in very bad shape, and they owe me a couple $100,000. That's all basically overdue. You can see what that would do to my cash flow. Yeah. Regardless of any other customers I have that might be stretching the 30-day boundaries on paying bills. So basically, I was in really, really bad financial shape. I don't think Diamond realized how bad a shape I was in. They might have chosen just to sit back and watch me go belly up and just move in afterwards. Geppi mentioned that he was somewhat aware, but that he still liked you and still wanted to make it a good deal for everybody. That's what he had told me. That makes some sense. It was not a golden parachute for me. I came out okay on the whole thing, but at one point I was almost really ready to walk away from the deal because Diamond did not offer me anywhere near what I thought they should be. But I got some things out of it that added up. I mean, they gave me X amount of money. I won't go into that, but they also didn't want my inventory, but they were willing to sell it on consignment. So I said, well, okay, we can do that. And it turned out to be a great deal for me because I got 70 cents on the dollar out of everything that they sold for me. They would have been much better off just buying it. They didn't take the money that was owed to me. That I pretty much got screwed on because once I was no longer a distributor, nobody had any reason to pay me unless they were honest people. But the guys that were slightly less than honest just go, yeah, we'll just stiff them, don't pay them. And so I lost a chunk of money that way. When all was said and done, I came out of it okay with and I hadn't gone belly up.
Right, that's important.
I also basically almost gave away Comics and Comix. Like I said, they had a negative net worth. Basically, I gave the Comics and Comix to my controller, my financial controller, for a token payment of $25,000, and he walks off with 7 stores.
What was his name?
Mark Crittenden.
Mark Crittenden.
He ran Comics and Comix for 10 years, but he ran it with an iron fist. He really had to crank down on the expenses and turn it from a money losing operation into a money making operation.
You got an Inkpot in 1994. What was that for?
Oh God, what did they call that? A friend of fandom, I think.
Oh, okay, I gotcha.
Yeah, probably for the same thing that I got in the 50 of DC Great. I mean, somehow I guess I represented somebody that was providing a good service for fans and had been around for a long time. I don't know. Nobody ever quite explained to me,
what the reason was. But for whatever the reason, it's well deserved from my perspective.
Yeah, I got it. It was nice, and also I got it from Dennis Kitchen, which was really very cool, because I really like Dennis a lot. He's a really, really great guy. So that was a real honor, to get it from him.
And then Ross Rojek bought it in Comics and Comix in 1996, and then in 2004, that's when the last 2 stores, Berkeley and Sacramento, closed, and he actually was arrested for fraud or something, right?
The story is, it's all hearsay, but he was trying to sell facial recognition. He was trying to sell stock in a proposed facial recognition company that actually there was nothing behind it or something. And I think the SEC came in and shut him down, and he went to jail, I believe, for a while. Wow. So that was the bitter end of Comics and Comix.
Kind of going now toward the present time, you continued dealing comics at San Diego Comic-Con all the way up through 2018, which was the 48th convention. Then I think from the way you explained to me when I asked you at the time, that you didn't sell at the 49th or 50th because you were just kind of tired and it was a big rigmarole and the money output wasn't that great to warrant all that. Is that correct?
I mean, there was a time in San Diego, we were the biggest players on the block. I mean, we had 10 booths before Marvel and DC and Paramount and the movie companies all came in back in the 90s.
Yeah.
In the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, I was a big player down there, and everybody came to get their books before the internet. And we continued to do real well, but 2008 was sort of the beginning of the end for San Diego for us. When the stock market crashed, suddenly our sales went way down in San Diego, which was not good when you got 10 booths and 11 employees, and you're hiring a tractor trailer to bring the stock down, because we'd bring 35,000 pounds of stuff down there. It was a big operation. From 2008 onward, it just sort of got worse and worse every year. There was more internet out there, more discounting of material, more people selling the kind of stuff we were selling. And I just couldn't, I went from 10 booths to 6 booths to 3 booths to whatever. And it just, no matter how fast I got smaller, the business dropped off faster, and it wasn't really as worthwhile to be down there. Yeah, I finally just decided, we got all the way down. It was embarrassing. I shouldn't have got down to one table. I should have just given it up. But we went down there with one 8-foot table one year, just to sort of have a presence. And, we took old material and we were selling old material and stuff, but it was just, we should have given up before that. And the big thing was, you sort of touched on it. It's the logistics of doing San Diego. It's a really, really long show. It's Wednesday through Sunday, Wednesday night through Sunday. So you have to set up on Tuesday.
Yeah.
Getting in and out of the show is really a burden with the Teamsters. They're perfectly nice guys, but they don't operate very efficiently. I mean, you could be in a truck line for 2 hours to get into the show, and then I've got to go find a place to park the truck, which there are no places in San Diego to park a big truck when you need to park it in a hurry. It's a marathon, It's down there from 8 o'clock in the morning until maybe 7 o'clock at night, talking to all kinds of wonderful people, but it's exhausting, it's draining. So when it started to go south financially, it wasn't nearly as much fun as it had been, and I figured, well, why keep doing it? I could come down here and buy old comics and make myself happy. I don't need to be here just to make other people happy. Everybody was happy to have us down there, but not enough people were buying material from us to make it continue to pay off.
And then you were a guest for the 2019 San Diego Comic-Con. That was the 50-year anniversary. They put you up in a hotel. You did a couple panels. How was that experience?
I felt really taken care of. I mean, they really gave me first-class treatment, as good as any, famous artist would have gotten. I mean, they flew us down there. They paid our parking at the airport. They put us up in the nice hotel. Ann and I had been staying at her friend's house in San Diego and having to commute in on the light rail system in the last few years to keep our expenses down. And here we were staying at the Marriott, and all the time in the world, and got to do a couple panels that were fun. So I had a lot of fun. It was really great. I'd go every year if they invited me like that,
Right, of course.
And I had lots of time to go scout for old comics, which is still my thing. Piled up big stack of acquisitions at the end of the show, and it was cool to walk out. I think I walked out of there Sunday around noon or something, which, if you were set up there, we wouldn't get out of there until 11:30 or midnight on Sunday night.
Right. Packing up. Yeah.
After 5 days of doing a show, and I'm wheeling around pallets in the back of a truck, walking out to the hotel and just sort of kicking back with a drink and calling a couple people on my cell phone at midday Sunday. I thought there was nothing better than that. So This is the way I should be doing this. This is pretty cool.
But the Bud's art books, that's basically what you've been doing since 1988 officially. And then you would go to conventions and deal and things like that all through Bud's art books, basically, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's where things are at now. Yeah.
When I sold out to Diamond, I was Bud Plant Incorporated, and I had to officially dissolve that corporation.
There you go. Yeah.
So that changed the name to Bud Plant Comic Art. And then in 2006 or 7, we got together with a consulting company to try to market our stuff better and try to reach out and hit more people, because we were doing pretty good. I think at that point, I don't know if the numbers matter or not, but we were doing about $4.5 million a year, which was a good chunk of money for a little retail business. So we were trying to make it more successful and everything and continue to grow. And we went to this consulting company, and they sort of talked us into changing our one consultant at the company talked us into changing our name, which we proceeded to do. And then the boss that originally got the account with us comes along and says, "Why did you change your name? Your name was kind of cool, I mean, why did you change it to this Bud's Art Books?" We go, "Because your consultant convinced us to do it." Because we were going to go out and compete with Amazon and compete in the real world, which was totally bullshit. We should have never tried to do that. We should have just stayed with our niche market,
That's what happened with the name. Okay.
Yeah. And so unfortunately, the business sort of went downhill from there through 2011. And then I did this major downsizing and rebuilt the business again, into what it is today.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. That's great insight. Because, I've been to your house, and then you have a lot of just comics just there anyway. But I know that you also have a warehouse from which you do things. Do you still go to that place to sell some books a few days a week? A commune?
Oh no, the co-op.
Co-op,
When COVID came along, I bailed out of there. That was called Book Camp. It's a little co-op of eight or nine booksellers. And I had a place in there for almost 20 years.
Okay.
And I was the comic book guy. I had a little comic book room. We called it Bud Plant's Amazing Fantasy Room.
Yeah. Oh, that's
still
cool.
Trying to capitalize on my name because it's been out there for 50 years. So why not?
Exactly. Yeah. I would have liked to have seen that before that went, but that's okay. Maybe you can show me pictures or something. So co-op, for some reason, I don't know why I was thinking commune and people swapping wives and things. I don't know what I was thinking.
So you've never been to my warehouse, my actual warehouse?
I don't think I've actually been to the actual Bud's Art Books warehouse.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you definitely have to come up there. I don't have any plans to close it, but so there's no deadline for you.
Yeah. I would love to.
We've been in there. We've been in there for something like 35 years.
Yeah.
I should have bought that building decades ago.
Because you would have already kind of made money off that. Yeah.
Yeah, I would have owned it. And yeah. But we built a mezzanine. The problem is we built a mezzanine into it. And so that halved our rent. It doubled our space and halved our rent. And so I just can't move out of there because it's such a good deal. I mean, I'm paying basically on 5,000 feet on the floor, but I've got a whole mezzanine I built myself with my money, and we use it all. I mean, we're 2,500 feet on the ground and 2,500 feet above. So we got 5,000 square feet, and it's getting full. It's getting fuller and fuller as we speak.
I bet it is. Yeah. This was a really great retrospective experience for me, looking back at your life with you. I know we've talked about a lot of this stuff, but it was always like pieces here and there. It was never from A to Z like the way we did today. So thank you so much for spending the time with me today here at the Comic Book Historians channel.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. It's been a lot of fun.